First of all, thank you everyone and welcome everybody to Chaucer Our Contemporary. I'm Alfred Ryan. I teach Chaucer and other medieval literature at Queen Mary, University of London. It's fantastic to see you all here. I know some of you have, battled the elements, and some people actually weren't able to make it due to storm, but we are here. And I want to say a little bit about how this event kind of came about, and a little bit about the program, what we're going to be doing today, and then we'll move straight into our first section. So I guess first of all, this originated in some conversations among academics at the University of London who teach medieval literature, and we wanted to have a sort of event which firstly sort of celebrated the fact that we're all teaching medieval literature, with a slight sort of sense of maybe some defiance there that we're still doing this and we want to keep doing it. But also with a real desire to find out and to build connections between university teaching and school teaching, and to talk to teachers who are also teaching medieval literature, or who want to teach medieval literature, or who once taught medieval literature and want to do it. So we want to sort of build those connections, and that was a really strong driver to get things going for this event. And also, on that note, I want to say that, we really want to foster quite informal and quite free conversations today. This isn't a sort of, nobody's the expert who's going to tell somebody else how to teach or what to teach. And in many ways, as somebody who teaches Chaucer, I have taught Chaucer for a long time at university, I'm conscious that things are kind of ossifying in my own teaching practices and needing to talk to other people. And actually, even in the conversations I've had so far with school teachers, I've actually realized that in many ways they're doing more innovative and more creative things than I'm doing. So it's very much about wanting to learn from others, to share experiences. And on that note, I would just say, please, there's no question that's kind of too stupid or too basic to ask today. If there are things you don't know, or resources you've never heard of, but would like to know more about, please just feel free to ask more and find out. I would like to, before going much further, just say we've had tremendous help in organising this event from the Institute of English Studies and the English Association. So it's a co-organised event. I would also, in fact, I need sort of contractually almost to say thank you to our sponsorship that we got from Queen Mary, University College London, and Royal Holloway. I did put Queen Mary at the top, but that's just this isn't an institutionally proven thing. But yeah, so thank you to all those groups and to Institute of English Studies and the English Association. Chaucer Our Contemporary, I should clearly told me a little while ago, we need an image for this. And I said, that's very true, we do. And then I completely forgot about it. I actually can't see very well. But the two images here show us that Chaucer has always been contemporary through the centuries. So there's a image of Chaucer from around 1700, which is based on images of Chaucer in medieval manuscripts, 15th century manuscripts. There's also this kind of completely mad 19th century imagining of Chaucer at the court of Edward III. The title Chaucer Our Contemporary was in my mind because I misremembered an article that appeared when I was an undergraduate called, I thought it was called Chaucer Our Postmodern Contemporary. When I searched, I must find it. Wait, where's it gone? I couldn't find it anywhere. Turns out it was Chaucer Our Derridean Contemporary from 1993 by Andrew Taylor, which shows us 1993 was probably peak Derrida. But Chaucer is contemporary, but always changing. And so we perhaps need to find a new Chaucer now, maybe, who is our contemporary. Anyway, I will just say a few things about the program. Not very much, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory. It's all here, with one exception, that when we do in the second breakout group session at 2:30, session 2.1 will be in room 102. It's on the first floor of the house, so just be aware of that. The other thing, just to note that there is wonderfully an exhibition in Senate House Library, just up the stairs on the fourth, or up the lift on the fourth floor. And what I would say about that, so with lots of good things you can see, facsimiles of Chaucerian manuscripts, etc., including a medieval manuscript. So encourage everyone to see that. I will lead a sort of party at 1:20 and 3:30, though you'll note that that's the first one's during the lunch break and the second one's coffee break. So I don't know if you don't want to give up on either of those things, and come with me, because we need to get through the barriers. You're welcome to go up at any other time. If you show them the program, and if you don't have a Senate House Library card, which you hopefully may not, just ask them, the people at the desk, to let you through and direct you to the Durning Lawrence Library where the exhibition is. If you have any questions about that, please just feel free to ask me. Okay. I think that's all I need to say on practicalities. When we get to the first breakout session, you will see that I've divided us into groups. That may change a little bit. There's some people who won't come, and there's some people who were not going to register, so that's fine. We will deal with that. Let me now just move to our first plenary session. And so this is a real pleasure to welcome Chris Green and Jacqueline Fonzulas. I thought maybe it would be a good idea to start off the day by getting kind of perspective on teaching Chaucer at secondary school level, and also perspective on teaching Chaucer at university, to kind of kick off our discussions. So I'm going to ask Chris Green, who is Director of English and Drama Faculty at the school in Cambridge, also an examiner, and as well as an author and editor, to come and talk to us about teaching Chaucer at school, Chaucer at school. So Chris, please come up. And we just need to yes.
Well, that's a relief to begin with. Right, well, Alfred, thank you very much indeed for the introduction and the welcome, and thank you for inviting me here today to talk on this subject. I'm going to be talking about approaches to teaching Chaucer in schools, in secondary schools. I don't think while I was walking down from King's Cross Station this morning that I haven't included primary schools at all in my talk, and whether that's an area that we could consider at some point. Just before I left school yesterday evening, I went to my bookstore and found this edition, Oxford University Press, Geoffrey Chaucer, General Product of the Canterbury Tales. It's from 1994, which perhaps says a lot about what I'm about to say during my talk this morning. But that was there in my store at school. Just a bit of introduction to who I am, just saying a little bit more about what Alfred introduced me as. So my job, which I think is the best in the world, is Director of English and Drama at the Perth School, which is a very particular kind of school in Cambridge. It's a selective, independent school. It's very large. It's a 3 to 18 school. And it does mean that we can, of course, do things in our own way. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the school context today generally, and about the way that schools are constrained in the way that they have to deliver the curriculum. And maybe that's why Chaucer doesn't feature very much in schools. But we are able to do things in our own way. I heard the head of the Michaela School on the radio this morning, just as I was leaving, and maybe that's somebody that some of you are familiar with, talking about the fact that she's horrified that free schools and academy schools are about to have a centrally imposed curriculum placed upon them by the government. I know that she has a very large sign outside her school saying we are not an independent school, trying to dissociate herself from some of the more liberal values perhaps that independent schools are a kind of safe haven for at the moment in school terms, and maybe that's been food for thought as well in the context of what I'm about to say. Now, I'm also principal examiner for OCR's A-level in English literature. That's the biggest, it's the most popular A-level in schools, and yes, it does have a Chaucer text on its syllabus. It's another privilege that I'm able to select the text for that specification and leave the marking of it. And we have the Merchant's Prologue in text, and it's quite popular, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. I'm also co-editor of the Use of English, which is the English Association's journal for secondary school teachers, which is another privilege to be doing. And I author for HarperCollins, particularly Shakespeare editions, school Shakespeare editions. So I'm not, as Alfred mentioned, I'm not a Chaucer expert by any means, but I'm a Chaucer fan. I'm going to talk a little bit about the general context of teaching in schools. I don't know how many of us here this morning are based in schools or in universities or colleges, but yes, there is a sense of crisis. Is there always with English, perhaps, in schools at the moment? And, a real sense of English changing, not just with AI, but with government policy, with social attitudes, of course, as well. And schools have really changed. If you haven't been into a school recently, they're very, very different places. They're places where knowledge is delivered from the front, much as I'm doing at the moment, with a PowerPoint presentation, which is then uploaded to some kind of central school system, which students can then go back to and revise or catch up on. They're not places where Socratic dialogue is taking place, and that phrase just kind of trips off my tongue. And it's interesting to hear that teachers are all using that phrase at the moment. Perhaps most of us don't really know what it means, but we're suddenly starting to think about what the purpose of being in the classroom is. So in that context, is there still a place for Chaucer? Is what we're thinking about at the moment. And on the right-hand side, this PowerPoint was just created by the click of a button. We're given software at school that means that we can just speak into a machine, press a button, and it comes up with material for the lessons that we're delivering. This is my very enlightened school, as I would perceive it to be. So there is a sense that in most schools around the country, the experience that students are getting between the ages of 11 and 18 is of lectures being delivered in class by PowerPoint. There is, of course, a fact for knowledge being much more important than skills in all teaching, and particularly in English teaching. It's very different in my context. We're allowed to do things differently. We're trying to keep dialogue going. We have a joint English and drama faculty, which means that we can use dramatic techniques in the classroom. We want students' voices to be heard. We want teaching to be student-centered. We want children up and acting and performing and talking and involved in collaboration. And we think we're the only subjects that are going to survive post-AI, of course. That means that Chaucer does have a place, in other words. So the research that I did for this talk this morning suggests that most schools haven't taught Chaucer A-level or GCSE for many years. So Chaucer doesn't really have a place in most classrooms. That's the headline. But I'll stay talk for a little bit longer. So the general prologue was, and perhaps many of us can remember it, a standard GCSE or before that, 40 years ago or so, an O-level set text. And it's the text that most people did as their poetry text at school 30 or 40 years ago. The idea of that today it's almost laughable, I'm afraid to say. It's just impossible to imagine that happening. The English curriculum now in schools is an inspector course, isn't it? That's what everybody does. There are a few other texts around it as well. But there are a few texts that are repeated over and over again. That's the way that it works in most schools, in most free schools, academy chains, and other types of schools as well. So Chaucer was often taught for A-level. I remember teaching Chaucer perhaps 10 years ago. We haven't taught Chaucer, as it happens, for about a decade, just the way that things have worked out. But the Knight's Tale, the Miller's Tale, the Franklin, the Merchant, they've all appeared at some point over the last 20 years, 30 years or so. And I've also got the idea that Chaucer always seems to be there in the background. Teachers are aware of Chaucer, students perhaps are as well. Chaucer might get a mention, but he's not there in any sense as a key curriculum element. And if he is, then he probably appears in Key Stage 3, so that's age 11 to 14, and maybe in a project sense, or maybe as part of looking at language or the way that language has developed over the years. We do use quite a lot this text at the bottom left here. I don't know how familiar with it you are, but it's a fantastic drama script. It's aimed at students who are perhaps in year 7 or 8, so 11, 12 or 13. It's a retelling of 6 or 7 of the Canterbury Tales by Martin Riley in modern English. I'm an English and drama teacher. I teach to my year 8 class, for example, this text every year. They absolutely love it. They'll go away in groups and they'll take a tale each and they'll come up with a project to develop a production of it, to stage it, then invent costumes, we'll film it, we might show the film to number 7 or something like that. It really emphasises the kind of rip-roaringness of Chaucer, the bawdy elements, but there's also a lot of serious stuff there as well that they really enjoy. In my school, where there is still a degree of freedom in terms of what teachers are choosing to deliver in the classroom, I have one colleague who's very passionate about Lord Arthur and does a whole project connecting bits of that. This is with year 7, so there are 11 and 12, these students. She also uses this Us Born Classics Retold version at the top left there, and she also links it in with Tennyson. It's a kind of big, like medieval mix of kind of vague stuff that the kids absolutely enjoy doing. They might perform the Lady of Shalott, they might produce collages, they might do recreative writing, linked on those texts, but do some serious contextual material in the background as well. We've also used top right the Peter Ackroyd retelling, which I think is much more add-on. I've read for a long time, and we've given that, for example, to good Key Stage 4 students, so students who are in years 9, 10 and 11. And the reality, as I put there, is that students have always enjoyed Chaucer. Whenever we give them Chaucer to do, whenever we cover Chaucer in some way, whatever it is, they absolutely love it. And they always find Chaucer much easier than Shakespeare as well. Once they've got beyond that initial barrier of this strange language on the page, which we start by reading to them, the first reaction is always that they fall on the floor with laughter at the sound of that Middle English being read, but that's the kind of very visceral response that they have, and they really enjoy Chaucer and the language and the tales and his entire world. And as I said, once over the language barrier, he's enjoyed by everybody in school. I don't know why I put on this slide, but my own memories, long way back in the 1980s, doing the Knight's Tale at school. what I remember of that, I remember one of these very charismatic teachers of the old school who would sit at the front with a cigarette, feet on the table, telling us kind of all the background, and then we'd go home in the evening and we'd translate and write it into our books. But I enjoyed it, actually. It was fun. So how much is taught? Hardly at all is the summary. He's never compulsory. Doesn't appear in a compulsory sense on any government document, specification, syllabus, or anything else. And you'll possibly be aware, I'm sure you'll be aware, that Shakespeare is the only named author in the English National Curriculum. He's the only author who has to be covered in schools for every student in England and in Scotland, but I think not in Wales as of the last couple of years. I think that's changed. Also, of course, in schools, as at university, Shakespeare being questioned. Should Shakespeare have that central place in the curriculum? Should we be looking at other writers around Shakespeare? Should we be looking at Shakespeare's sisters in the classroom and all the rest of it? And all these questions coming into schools. And then, I've said it, that contemporary and relevant and decolonised, I think they've all got kind of invisible air quotation marks around them, texts are more popular and important. And of course, that's in school, just as most of us you're doing in university. We're completely revisiting what should be on the curriculum, what shouldn't be on the curriculum. It's a very divisive issue. It's part of the culture wars and all that, so as you know. So we do use Chaucer in extension sessions in sixth form. We have some fantastic, bright, engaged sixth form students who go on to top universities and do English or related subjects. We run special Oxbridge sessions for them. Never sure how useful they really are, but we always include Chaucer in that. Perhaps it's because we feel we ought to. We don't quite know why we do, but we feel it's important that there should be Chaucer, because perhaps they're going to be encountering Chaucer in some format when they get to the next level at university. And Chaucer doesn't appear, just to be absolutely clear, then in any GCSE specifications. There's no mention at all, there's no general prologue, there's no option of doing Chaucer at GCSE. You can't even do Chaucer as a kind of extra to write an essay on an assessed essay or something like that. And I've also got perhaps slight controversy at the end there, as with Milton, who does appear on the A-level syllabus, so students can opt to do 2 books of Paradise Lost. But there is that feeling, isn't there, everywhere, that religious context in Chaucer and in Milton and certain other authors is perhaps not only unappealing, perhaps unsuitable. Maybe there's the idea there that we shouldn't be covering these texts because that religious context is inappropriate in some way. Just putting that out there as an idea. And that idea, it certainly exists in schools with some teachers. So the picture on the right-hand side is from the animated films you're possibly familiar with, but I think they're early 1990s. Did they come from the same Russian studio who did the Shakespeare animations as well, I think? Great fun, we do use those with students. The main towns that are taught for A-level tend to be the Knight, the Villain, the Franklin and the Merchant, as I've said. Which A-level specifications does he appear on? So it's the automatic PowerPoint that came up with this question and answer format. So he's there on my OCR specification, the Merchant at the moment, and you're possibly aware that because of COVID and a number of other things in the last decade, the set text on these specifications haven't changed for about 10 years. They used to change every couple of years. Now they're there for 10 years, and there's no sign of any of these texts changing maybe for another 5 years. There's going to be 15 years the same texts are there. For AQA, which is one of the other major A-level awarding bodies, of course, they do the nun's priest. Any other awarding bodies, there are no set texts, but for the Welsh board, Chaucer is there as a core author, whatever that means. Other literature of the period, apart from more darker, or related period, I suppose, it's just not covered at all. I do have a colleague who has used Beowulf, the Simon Armitage modernised version, and even some Anglo-Saxon riddles, but Piers Plowman or anything else, Toilets and Crusade, nothing like that gets a mention at all in school at any point. And then, again, another controversial route at the bottom there, I'm suggesting that teachers don't all have the skills to cover Chaucer in school. Maybe that always was the case, but maybe it's one of the things that we could assume that teachers did know a little bit of Chaucer and they'd be able to deliver Chaucer. Also that they'd be quite flexible and able to maybe teach themselves a bit of Chaucer or move into that area. But now, because we find that very few teachers have covered Chaucer at university, and of course we now have teachers coming to us from all kinds of different paths, all kinds of different English degrees, or non-English specialists, it means that very few of them know anything about Chaucer. They're frightened by Chaucer, finding intimidating, don't really know where to begin with Chaucer. And I've also suggested that teachers are no longer as flexible as they used to be. And I think that is the truth. I think it's not any younger teachers, but some younger teachers don't have that ability to kind of move from text to text to suddenly be teaching, as I can remember doing back at the beginning of my career, say an Iris Murdoch novel at an A-level 1 year, and then maybe Tristram Shandy the next year. I mean, just that idea seems quite alien to what teaching is all about today. It's become a very, very tough job. Of course, we love telling everybody how tough it is, but it's become a very tough job. Lots of administration, no time to learn and study new text. So it's hard to see how Chaucer would get in there, but thinking about a few approaches and the way things could change, I've got a few suggestions to be slightly more optimistic at the end as well. So in a school like mine, we try to deliver Shakespeare as a script for performance. We're trying to get away from the idea that we need to decode Shakespeare and other poetry. We're trying to kind of immerse students in the language so that they enjoy it and don't try to understand every word. What school students want at the moment is to understand everything in this very complex world they're a part of. Of course, we don't have those explanations anymore. So we try to abandon that approach, and we try to help students to immerse themselves and enjoy what's there. That's what we do with Shakespeare, and I'm wondering whether something similar might be possible for Chaucer as well. I don't know what that would be, but it would be great if some solutions to that came up today at this conference. They do want to unpick every meaning. They do want to know exactly what things mean. They want to know what a poem means. They come to our lessons, but then afterwards they go to YouTube to find these gurus like Mr. Bruff, to find out exactly, so Mr. Green has said whatever it is about this poem, has gone on about what it might be in the lesson, and I want to know what it means. And it'll be the same with Chaucer as well, I want to know that. And of course the first thing they'll do, as they do with Shakespeare, is to put the text into AI. And that'll translate the Canterbury Tale for them, or the Shakespeare play, tell them everything that they need to know, which means, of course, they're not really studying in a conceptual way, they're not studying in a literary way in any sense. So to hopes for the future, that language barrier might just be a positive feature. Maybe in schools we could embrace that and turn it into a kind of project to get students looking at how languages change, what is Middle English all about, why is it so significant that Shakespeare's writing when he was, with language changing at the time, and certain students would be very interested to work on that sort of idea. So a linguistic project, so my second bullet point, researching, maybe looking at narrative voice, narrative technique. A lot of students will find that very interesting along the way. Of course, there's so much of that in Canterbury Tales, elsewhere in Chaucer. Looking at earlier forms of English, writing their own version of English, maybe inventing their own language as well, having a look at where some of the gaps were along the way. How is English going to develop into the future? And approach Chaucer from that sort of angle. All of this is going to take a lot of work in the classroom, and not everyone's going to feel comfortable doing it. Not all senior leaders in school would be comfortable with that sort of approach either, I think I need to add. My boss would be. They can write their own Canterbury Tale, so be creative. Choose a character and write a new tale, or choose one of the tales that we haven't, no longer exist, and produce that. All writing like that, though, needs to happen in supervised conditions. It can't happen at home because we're just being submitted AI-produced work the whole time. So we're now having to dedicate specific lessons to students writing in controlled conditions and writing by hand. How that's going to work out in the future, I can't possibly imagine, but that's what's happening at the moment. Should we maybe have a Key Stage 3 unit on Chaucer? Is that the best place to have it between the ages of 11 and 14? Rather than thinking of him as an exclusively A-level author. What about looking at the medieval context? Some students will love that, where it kind of, some people will be horrified by this idea, but where it kind of overlaps with fantasy, which students, a lot of students really love in school, and maybe profit from that in some way. Maybe using the story to outlines for drama, a bit like the text I mentioned at the beginning, looking at context, current issues, just picked up on the role of women in society, which students still love discussing. We can kind of get talking about these things, looking at the medieval world. And then finally, please can somebody here or somewhere produce some resources for us, because I don't think there's a lot out there for that, and it would be really helpful just to have some really simple resources that we could use. And then last couple of points, there is a real lack of awareness in schools about how much Chaucer is taught at university and how Chaucer is then taught at university. And we'd really like to know that as well. That's one symptom, isn't it, of this disjunct, this kind of fact that we don't really connect always between school teaching of English and university teaching. And a few conclusions from me, semi-serious. So the important thing is that from my experience, whenever Chaucer is introduced in schools, whatever stage it's at, students seem to love engaging with Chaucer and reading the tales and talking about them and analysing them. And they do find his work easier than Shakespeare very often. And those contextual issues might just be a way in that they really enjoy. And finally, of course, the fun, the gaudiness, the political incorrectness, whatever you want to call it, which we can kind of help hopefully deliver in the right way, will always be popular and students will really see that. So if there are any questions, is there time for that? Or any comments?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. First of all, that was fantastic. And okay, so it's a real pleasure to introduce Jackie Cazulas, Professor of Medieval Literature at Scots at the University of Cambridge, teaches medieval literature, including a paper on Chaucer, the author of Chaucer the Basics, and the Advanced York Notes on the Life of Bards and Franklin Poets and Powers. I used this because one of my students I once found reading that book in class. But yeah, Jackie, you can talk about teaching Chaucer at university.
So it's really lovely to be here today, especially because I'm a Chaucer convert. So to stand at the front of the room and talk about Chaucer, if you told me this 30 odd years ago, I just wouldn't have believed you, because I literally ran, not quite a mile, about a quarter of a mile from Chaucer. After my first literature session at university on Chaucer, I decamped to the language centre, thinking, okay, I'll do something else. But of course, Chaucer caught up with me there as well. And the second time I encountered Chaucer, I had a truly brilliant teacher, so somebody called Jeremy Smith at the University of Glasgow, who was an absolute star. And he made all the difference. So the fact that teachers, lecturers are here thinking about this process, it's what will keep Chaucer on the syllabus. And of course, no student does this alone. It's possible to come to a modern work and think, okay, I have all these fields. None of our students at school or at university are going to come away from Chaucer thinking, I know how to do this. So there needs to be scaffolding. And there we go. I've put two of my books up there, not to say, hey, I've written books, so I don't remember what they are. But as a kind of sign of my commitment to teaching the students, at that ground level, because if they don't come in at the ground level, we've lost them, obviously. And teachers might not know this, but at university, you get 0 credit for writing books like this. So in the great kind of, promotion, sort of hoo-ha, it's peaceful, it's nice that you've done it, but what else have you done? But it really matters. So what is the status of medieval literature in the universities? It's good. for lots of them, I think. And I'm not going to speak. I mean, my colleagues are here from London and Birmingham and sort of all sorts of places. But the courses that I know, because I teach or I'm an external examiner or something, Bristol students at the moment, the first years have arrived straight into medieval literature, compulsory medieval literature for their first semester. That is their subject. Durham, compulsory medieval paper, nobody escapes. I don't think they do it straight away, but it's there. And Cambridge, we still have sort of this great sort of compulsory medieval paper. Now what that means is, and anybody from Cambridge will know this, you walk into the auditorium, compulsory 200 students sitting there, all sitting like this, the kind of, go on and press the sentence, we don't want to be here. And as I say, I understand that. But they're forced over the threshold, and then they stay for the options that they can choose. And actually, last year, so we do 2 medieval optional papers for our third year. So one of them is Chaucer, and one of them is medieval supernatural. And medieval supernatural, which is possibly a genius of marketing, actually, is a really good name. So medieval supernatural last year was the second most popular option of all of our papers. So it beat all the modern ones. This year, I think, is actually top. So everybody wants to do the Middle Ages. Chaucer, not so much. But that's because you can do tons of Chaucer on medieval supernatural and keep your options open. So we're currently deciding what we want to do with our Chaucer paper in terms of maybe just expanding it a little bit. So initial hostility, partly possibly because it's compulsory, partly because so many of them haven't done anything like it at school. And there is, as Chris has mentioned, the language barrier. Now, Cambridge is changing. We've kind of stopped doing medieval grammar. So, in the old days, you would sit down, sort of straight away before you launched into Middle English, you'd be given a verb. You'd get given, verbs in modern tense. We don't do that anymore. And what we've replaced it with is much more, as Chris has described, reading aloud. So we jump straight in, and we tell students, so we have classes actually for reading, we tell students to read in an extreme version of their own language. So wherever they're from, they're their dialect language. Now, that actually works really well, unless there are key speakers. In which case, they're invited to use my accent, if that's easier. And we still have a Chaucer Reading Prize at Cambridge. We run it every 2 years. And one of the judges the other year said to me, one of your students has won the Chaucer Reading Prize, Jackie. And I said, well, that's great. How do you know it was one of my students? They said, they speak with a Scottish accent. That's what it comes to. So we also examine differently. For a long time, there was a compulsory section, something will remember it, on the Cambridge Triplods, where you had to translate, well, originally 3 sort of set text passages. It's all gone. What we're replacing it with are sections where we ask students to do a commentary. We ask them to pick out a couple of words. So, what is the difference between seemingly here and seeming there? And we also give them a couple of lines of a translation and say, comment on the strengths or weaknesses of this translation. One of us makes up. So it's usually very archaic or it's ultra-modern in order to get them to grapple. Because we thought to ourselves, what actually are we examining? And making them go off and just learn things by rote, which of course some of them are very good at. Sort of really wasn't sort of the aim. But what we found by backing off from the go and learn a great chunk of circulating in the green light is that they do love the language. And I found this with younger groups as well, because my university, my college were very keen sort of to get involved with schools. I'm actually my faculty's outreach officer. And we're getting involved with them at a young age. So essentially, our view is that if students haven't already started thinking about university by the age of 10, it might be a bit late. If you're going to say to them, aim for sort of a great university, they need to know it early. And therefore, as a result, there's quite a few different things that I've done with schools. And I've brought along this because it's one of the most surprising and exhausting sessions I've ever done with any group ever. So in a group of maybe year 7, so 11 years old. And I brought them, they were all boys, and I brought them the Ellesmere night, thinking that we were going to talk about medieval knights and war horses and sort of mercenaries and I mean, I think teachers will be more familiar with this probably than lecturers are. Within the first minute and a half, somebody had said, "What's all of this stuff?" So, and why is it writing? And sort of, what's that later? And suddenly we were off down a kind of helter-skelter ride of sort of copying manuscripts and before the printing press, and there were actually sort of letters that sort of dropped out of usage, and that was the sort of thing that they wanted to talk about. They were 11 years old and they're in the rest of my books. They wanted to know about the letters. I was in Bradford recently as well, and I started by saying to them, okay, so Bradford, Viking country, east of the Danelaw, what did the Vikings ever do for us? And again, they brought us pronouns, but, students, it's not part of the curriculum, I understand that, but they love it. And so, one of the ways in sort of may well be more of this. Other barriers. Well, one of the barriers I think might be the way in which people, often politicians, use the word medieval as an insult. So anything anybody doesn't like is a medieval thing. And that's something that's quite hard for us to fight against. It all seems very long ago. From the outside, it can seem very white and monocultural, although we know actually it's not. And a quick look at Chaucer's physician takes you into a world of Arabic medicine, and Islamic golden age material that it's really a boost to lots of students. And then of course, as Chris has mentioned, there's religion. And now, I think the government coming along thinking, lots of religion, from the Middle Ages, it could be problematic. When it comes to the Middle Ages, I didn't know the half of it. Because what they're probably thinking is, here's something that's very Church of England. And in fact, medieval religion is a wild and crazy thing. So I was looking at all my pictures and thought, okay, this is one of the most decent ones I could bring me. So there is Noah, usually stark naked, as well as drunk, but he's covered for the purposes the Doge's plan is. And there's his 2 sons, or 2 of his 3 sons, having a bit of a word about their dad. Because what do you do about this embarrassing old man? And the Middle Ages, of course, thought that Bible good, therefore more Bible better. And so if you come across a bit of the Bible that you just think, well, Adam and Eve, 2 sons, or maybe 1 children, let's add another one. So second 3 sons. And then of course there must have been doctors as well. You add them into the mix. So what you actually end up with in terms of religion is something utterly irreverent. Because I think that's probably the most dangerous thing about religion with younger children. Is the fact that in a society which is very, very secure about its own religious beliefs, they tell outrageous jokes. So they add all sorts of things. And my students love this. They really do. They love the fact that there is nothing that the Middle Ages will not mock. So they love the fact that there are no rules, even in language, that there are no rules. And we, as university teachers in Cambridge, have really changed our approach, kind of going with that, as a general idea. So, we have had many degrees in Cambridge who are phenomenal. So Barry Windayat, A.C. Spearing, Jill Mann, etc., who all did amazing things from your dog. So I'm not impugning them at all. But in corners, people were saying things to their students like, well, there's no point reading Chaucer unless you've already read the De Consolatione Philosophiae. So you see why I ran. So we take a slightly different perspective. And of course, students are not coming to us with the same skills. They are just as bright, but they have got different skills. Hardly anybody has Latin, that is fine. The Bible. Again, very few people have read the Bible. And of all the lectures that I do, the one on the introduction to the Bible is absolutely packed with people who want to know, there's this thing they keep hearing mentioned, what exactly is it? New Testament, Old Testament, they keep hearing the words. And actually, in those as well, it's interesting that Muslim students often have a better sense because the Quran and the New Testament overlapping. The many students who've had no faith backgrounds at all. So, thinking my students don't know Latin, so what do I do? So, when I want to teach something like this, the adversity to bring the animal the method bath, I know if I put up a slide like that, even with all these lovely bright students, everybody had just mentally retreated to the back wall. So nobody's doing that. So instead, they sit through various things like the lion is literally consequences of these things. And what I'm wanting to tell my students is this marvelous voice that is the wife of that. This great romping flow of hers. Chaucer didn't make this stuff up. He mostly took it from Jerome, the great translator of the Bible, the man who brought you the Vulgate. And then he takes these words. Jerome was arguing with Juvenian, who had the audacity to think that marriage might be an acceptable thing to do in this world. So he's saying absolutely not. So while he rescues the team's little lion there, Chaucer is taking those words and flipping them around and giving them to the wife. So with my students, I'm using a ton of pictures. Okay, so it's the most, you are wearing your Middle Ages, the most visual period possibly before this. So there's that and there's that. Because there's no space that the Middle Ages isn't wanting to cover with images. This is fairly random but fairly standard. No corner of any church that they won't add something to. Even unexpectedly, there's a green lamb from me, sort of, in the Lady Chapel. I can give a whole lecture on that, but, I'll spare you. With the little misericords with bagpiping pigs and cats. And then, I suppose, where I'm wanting to get to in the life of Bath, and lots of lesbian literature, is the fact that you have your main sense of what medieval literature is, your main text, your Bible, etc., but all sorts of things happening around the edges. And so when we get to the Canterbury Tales, of course, isn't the kind of, the very bottom of society to the very top of society. All this bunched new middle class. But there's this frolicking on the edges. So the antidote to the Middle Ages is the study, I suppose, of the counterculture. So it's the baboons. It's the fact that when you have a medieval soldier that says, I said in the midst of my days I shall go to the gates of hell, the artist comes along and draws you quite a nice, enticing picture of the gates of hell, so it's very much have it at the side. And possibilities for the kinds of Chaucer stories that my students are looking at. So I'm asking them if they're looking at a rejected world. Are they looking at sort of something that is supposed to be pushed aside? Are they looking at joyful alternative? Or is it a bit of controlled play? You're allowed to walk around like the wife of Bath. Another thing I do, though, because I think I did something on the wife of Bath. It may not be on edXL anymore, but was for a while at least. So is compare the differences between the Elsia manuscript, which is produced not long after Chaucer was born. Chaucer or a family member possibly had some oversight into this. To the extent that the pictures really do match up with what's said in the general prologue. And the 1492 edition. And I think this probably works with younger kids as well as my 19-year-olds, but my 19-year-olds really like it. So what is the difference between that woman and that woman? Picking up on things like, she has a whip. That one has lost her whip, she has got it. So why would that change? Also, and it can be wonderfully eagle-eyed, there's spurs on the wife of Bath. You can't wear spurs and ride side saddle in patches of. So again, the artist knows that she's described this great big horse. In 1492, she sits outside. So what happens to the world between one century and the other century is this the starting point. And of course, I'm off galloping my students towards the Reformation and what happened to the status of women. But there's all sorts of things that you can do with this kind of material. So that's a very quick, it says approaches to Chaucer University. It's kind of an approach in the time of political. I'm sure other people are doing other things. But what I think probably comes out of it is the fact that it's sort of like what schools can do with their students. Just a bit further along. And it would probably and a final picture, just because I love it. Oh no, that's the wife of Bath, the one that drives them absolutely crazy. There's Adam and Eve and the serpent, and she's a lovely little serpent with a woman's face, and a rump. And that essentially sets us off on two rods, all by itself. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
So hopefully that's been a useful discussion. And one of the things that then we were hoping that we would be able to share are sort of suggestions for particular resources. So to talk a bit more about that, Alistair is going to tell us about editions and ways to get access to medieval manuscripts, which maybe of you seen quickly.
Okay, well, it's lovely to be asked to do this. This is just a very, very kind of brief and brisk overview to some of the editions that are available for thinking about Chaucer and for teaching Chaucer. In the group I've just been part of, we've been talking about the resources that are sort of available in schools, the texts that are available in schools. I'm kind of conscious, I suppose, will be interested to hear from you afterwards in the Q&A if there's time, or just kind of in discussion afterwards about how much freedom you have to choose the edition, or whether the editions, the text that you use is kind of coming through via an example, or what's happening there. But hopefully it's worth thinking about editions of what they offer and what different kinds of editions there are. Even if you're not in a position to choose what edition to put in your students' hands, these are still resources that you can use, hopefully, to kind of to develop approaches to teaching Chaucer of your own. So see if I've got a... There we go. I was thinking, what should I put up on the slide? This is the photo of my Chaucer shelf, my office. Just above it, you can just see the boss with the little pit bound shelf, which is much more exciting, and that's for another time. And so there are loads and loads of different editions of Chaucer. That's just the first thing that kind of, I suppose I need this anyway, but it struck me again putting a little kind of presentation together. And they do all sorts of quite like wildly different things in terms of who the audience they're speaking to and the kinds of material, the kinds of things they're trying to make available to those audiences. I suppose for many of us, definitely I think this is true undergraduate teaching, particularly kind of first and second year. Like, what do we want an edition to do? Perhaps the primary thing, the first thing we want the edition to do is to kind of to let your students access the poem as transparently as is possible, and so ways in which that Middle English text can just kind of become available to them, whether that's the supplying glosses around the text in the margins, linguistic apparatus, whether that's supplying explanatory notes that help you to contextualize what's happening. But there are other kinds of editions as well, and editions that might be kind of the sorts of things that you might introduce in the right kind of third year undergraduate course, definitely at postgraduate level, where the edition is telling you much more about the process of how it's made, where it's more explicit about the methodology that it's used to decide to establish the text from the readings of different manuscripts, and where it's presenting a kind of a body of like technical material that you can use to sort of see the choices the editor has made. Some of that is highly specialised kind of technical stuff, but some of it can be useful for us as well in different teaching contexts. I tried to sort of map out for this presentation what editions of Chaucer are and what they are. I suppose the top one on this slide is the go-to edition in many contexts. The Riverside Chaucer, and based in Turner Robinson's edition of Chaucer, and third edition in the product of the 1980s. This is still the kind of standard text for both students and scholars, actually, I would say, at university level. There are some journals, some academic journals, that insist you quote for this edition, unless there's a really kind of good reason not to, unless like variations to the edition is the actual thing we're writing about. The Riverside Chaucer is pretty widely available in the UK. OUP publishes it. You can get hold of a paperback at an affordable price. You can ask your undergraduate class to buy, but it's no longer available in the US, and it's quite hard to get hold of a copy. And that is one of the reasons why we are currently seeing the production of quite a few different complete works of Chaucer now, which are emerging into the marketplace. The Norton Chaucer, edited by David Lawson, is already available. And that's a complete works that folds into it, actually, some of the pre-existing Norton editions there. Catherine Lynch Dream Vision edition, for example, is just kind of compiled into that Norton Chaucer. And that's a text that's aimed at students. Then there's the Oxford Chaucer, which I confess it is out. Haven't actually had that physically in my hands because it's 250 quid to buy a copy. And so even my college library isn't that interested in that. But forthcoming, there is a paper, very much more affordable paperback edition which we'll have a look at. And there's a forthcoming Cambridge works. I've had a very tiny role in that. I've done the partners prologue and tell for that edition. Whereas the Cambridge one will kind of come out as a big hardback scholarly edition with lots of nerdy textual notes or lively, and then a student edition with quite a different set of apparatus around it. And on top of all of those, we can also kind of point to some important editions of individual works, just some of which I've mentioned here. So, I like to teach the Canterbury Tales from Jill Mann's excellent Penguin Classics edition, which I'll show you some images of. And there's a very good Troilus and Crusade from Penguin, edited by Barry Windsor, and super kind of useful single or individual text editions to think about there as well. So, what can you find in a modern edition, and how can you use it? So I'm sure I'm telling you what you know already in many cases here, but under three headings we could think about what's there to find in a modern edition. Language support, whether that's end-line or footnote glosses, an introduction to the language, usually part of the general introduction at the start, usually a glossary at the back. I find that unless you direct students to the other bits of the edition, they rarely kind of go beyond the language support that's right there on the page. Explanatory notes. Sometimes you get these very briefly at the foot of a page, sometimes, as in those Penguin editions, you get quite extensive, detailed explanatory notes at the back. And those explanatory notes often have different kinds of emphasis, like some are notes primarily on sources, analogues, allusions in the text. Some aspire to be like a sort of comprehensive guide to criticism, which is something that quickly goes out of date in an edition, obviously. And then textual notes. And some editions will have almost none of this, like the notes on the editor's decisions, the manuscripts they use, a list of the varying readings that they rejected. All of these kinds of things find in more scholarly editions and rarely, I suppose, in student editions. Let me give you a little tour of some editions where it look like. There's the Wyford Bart prologue from the start of this, the Riverside Chaucer version. You see you get quite a lot of text on the page there. These are your glosses at the foot of the page. And my students tend to find they need a little bit more than this provides, honestly. These glosses, obviously kind of pitched at student readers when they were originally conceived, are not enough now, I think, for undergraduate readers to make sense of the poem. There's the explanatory notes from the same edition and the textual notes as well, and on two different bits of the Wyford Bart's prologue. Side by side on the slide, they're actually different bits of the edition. We might compare with that. This is Jill Mann's edition for Penguin. So in this edition, you get much less text on the page and more by the way of glosses at the bottom that are kind of helping you to understand and decipher the language. And this is an example of one of her explanatory notes from the back of the book. Substantial amounts of text there, a head note, quite long discursive notes about different aspects of the context. These are really useful in the classroom. I find that students will rarely turn to those explanatory notes without a prompt, but turn to them they will. And they're full of good resources for kind of getting you to other places as well. So if you're thinking about what can a student read contextually around this Canterbury Tale, thinking about some of the texts and passages of those texts that Chaucer was in dialogue with or drawing on, these explanatory notes are a really rich archive of that material, and material that I think you can bring into the classroom with the seminar in interesting ways. What sorts of things can you do with an edition like this? in the seminary. Well, here are some things I've done recently. Build your own linguistic resources. It's already kind of emerged in both in like group discussion and also in what people have been saying, and Jackie's earlier talk about what level of kind of linguistic guidance do you want to offer to a student approaching this language? Is it like how much linguistic support is too much linguistic support? How much is kind of off-putting? And how much is enabling? I think that's a difficult balance to strike. But using the kind of material that you find in editions can be a good way into helping students to work out what support they need for themselves. So I would often encourage students, for example, to think about building a little kind of sort of go-to cheat sheet or useful kind of list of kind of pointers for reading Middle English that sort of removes the need to turn to the glossary every time. Lots of teachers, I think, of Chaucer will encourage their students to make a note for themselves a list of small words that recur a lot. And ac, meaning but, and I, meaning always. These words are so common that editors probably won't gloss them, but they kind of change the meaning of sentences. They're a useful thing to do. So using the addition to kind of get students thinking about building their own kind of support for the language. Glossing the text exercise. Present students with an unglossed photocopy. Get them to underline for you the words that they don't understand. What are the things where if you were editing this, you would need a gloss? Then you can compare it to what the editor has glossed, and you can kind of match up, and you can talk about the choices that have been made there. We've talked about intertextual connections already, but the explanatory notes as a starting point for your research and your students' research into sources and analogues, really important. Reading through the glossary, using the glossary to identify other examples of keywords, either in your particular tale or across the corpus of Chaucer's works. This can be a really good way to kind of think about if there's a particular term that's kind of become the focus of classroom discussion, both because you've wanted to decipher what it means or because it seems thematically loaded in the context of a particular tale or reading, finding other places where Chaucer has used it and tracing its use through that text or across his output could be an interesting classroom exercise too, one you can extend using the Middle English dictionary. There's loads more we could say about all this kind of stuff, but I wanted at the end of this editions thing just to draw your attention to the really wide range of places now where you can see original manuscripts online. And this slide mentions the two big famous Canterbury manuscripts, Ellesmere and Penguet, both of them completely digitised. You can see every page in really high resolution detail. And at the Huntington Library, Ellesmere, the National Library of Wales, Penguet. And there's a great toilet on Crusade with frontispiece, beautiful frontispiece, which Chaucer is reading from a pulpit to an audience of Courtney lovers. And that's online at the Parker Library in Cambridge. And there are loads of Chaucer manuscripts, and there are loads of places that have digitised them, but Digital Bodleian, Cambridge University Library has its own digital archive, John Ryland's Library in Manchester, Wren Digital Library at Trinity College, Cambridge. There's many more, and Yale has an excellent one, the Reinecke Library, more. The British Library does a question mark next to it, and some of you will be aware that they still haven't recovered many of their digitised manuscript resources up to the cycle time, nearly 2 years ago, but we hope that will become available eventually. What can you do with these kinds of things? I feel like we've already started to think about how just an encounter with these objects and the kind of the visual layouts of the page can be exciting and stimulating and engaging with students. There's a life of class there already in this very image and this very manuscript of that. But this is an interesting way, I think, to take students into the visual world of a different culture and to think about the way that the text they're reading in front of them might look different in its original form. Those questions about letter forms that we mentioned earlier and about the representations of marginalia, all of these things are exciting. And to make a point about editions as well, spotting the difference between what your edition is doing and what this manuscript is doing can be very instructive. not just in terms of orthography. Almost every Chaucer edition, for whatever reason, takes out the thorns and the ox. It's kind of, the forthcoming Cambridge edition won't do that. It will preserve the manuscript, probably. Punctuation, where students love to tell you about, Chaucer ended this sentence with an exclamation mark for emphasis. Well, no, he didn't. That's the editor's intervention. But you do have punctuation here. All those kind of verbings there in the middle of the lines are marking metrical features of the text. So there's lots to say about the layout and what it looks like and how it's presented. You could talk about paratexts here. Here's the wife of Bath kind of asking, how many husbands are you allowed to have? And in the margin, here's St. Jerome greatest of boys. It's not really clear. That kind of sense that you've got an apparatus around these texts that their original readers would have encountered, that modern editions don't preserve this in the same way. And then a final thought, it's often good to think about Faragnalla's manuscript. Canterbury Tales circulate as a collection, basically, but not always. Some of those tales exert in their peer alongside other things. Here's a manuscript with Troilus and Crusade, next to Piers Plowman and Banagle's Travels and a bunch of other things. What happens when medieval readers turn the page of these books? They find different things to what we find in an edition. So I'll stop there because I've been probably talking for too long, but there's lots of, to sum up, editions are speaking to very different audiences, not all of whom are going to be in your seminar rooms or classrooms, but beyond the ones you might put in front of your students, it's worth thinking about the resources these editions offer for teaching, preparing materials for teaching. And then I strongly encourage you to think about these kind of digitized manuscripts. It's such a rich resource, and it really opens up the world that these texts come from. I have a handout which I'll circulate digitally because it's full of links, but it will give you some links to places where you can find those Chaucer manuscripts and lines. I think that would be useful. Okay, I'll stop there and let that lead to materials.
Thanks everyone, thank you Alistair. I'm following on from Alice's talk, and I'm just going to talk a bit about Chaucer's sort of literary background and the way in which we can use that to help aid our teaching and assist our reading with Chaucer. Thinking also about sort of other contemporary writers, of sort of thinking about kind of from a slightly different approach, Chaucer's contemporaries and sources and how that can help us read and think about Chaucer. I'm also going to spend a bit of time at the end just very quickly mentioning some of the women writers that might be useful as reference points to Chaucer's works. Now, I was thinking about how to kind of work my way into this, and I thought what I'd do is sort of approach it initially by reflecting on my own teaching practice at UCL, so just down the road. Now, all of our students at UCL have to do a lot of compulsory medieval teaching. In their first year, they do a full year of medieval teaching. They do Old English and Middle English, and in their second year, they do a full year of Chaucer, and they read Chaucer in the original language. And in that year of Chaucer, they do all of Chaucer's major works. They do the Dream Visions, they do some of the short poems, they do Troilus and Crusade, and in the spring term they do the Canterbury Tales, and a whole term devoted to it. Now, hang on, I need to press the button to show you. This is what the course is for. Chaucer and his literary background. And as that sort of title suggests, what the students are doing is, yes, they're reading the works in the original language, and they're analysing them and thinking about them in a literary sense. But they're also considering Chaucer's works alongside the sources, the literary traditions, the material that Chaucer's used to compose his own text, and which directly inform what he's writing. And the benefits of that approach, I think, are twofold. On the one hand, it allows students to understand the extent to which students are kind of to understand the extent that Chaucer is sort of steeped in the work of other writers. But it also, at the same time, gets them to appreciate how innovative he was. And why he is, in my view, and in our collective view, maybe justly celebrated as the kind of first authorial celebrity who is writing in and with the English language. So I'm going to run through some text resources and approaches that I use when I'm teaching on this course, that we use at UCL to sort of demonstrate how thinking about Chaucer in relation to the source material, to these contemporaries, can kind of help us all, including our students, open out our thinking about Chaucer and his works. So where I'm going to start is by thinking about Chaucer in relation to his source material. Now, you will all know that Chaucer is extremely well read, greatly admired the work of his close contemporary or contemporary writers on the continent, especially those in France and in Italy. And that is something we encourage our students to think about right from the start of this course. At the beginning of this course, we're thinking about the dream vision poems in particular. And one of the sources we point our students to is this by Barry Windiat. We've mentioned his name already. It's the Chaucer's Dream Poems, Sources and Analogues. And what it includes is lots of translations of extracts or the whole text of the sources that Chaucer is using when he's writing his dream vision poems. Now, one of the first texts we teach on this course is it's Chaucer's sort of first major poem. It's called The Book of the Duchess. Some of you might have read it at university. It's often, I think, taught in some university courses. This is a dream vision poem. It's written as an elegy for the wife of John of Gaunt, who was Chaucer's patron. Now, that poem, The Book of the Duchess, has a classical source. It draws on Ovid. It has a version of one of Ovid's an account in the Metamorphoses. But it is largely indebted to the work of French writers, particularly these two, Guillaume de Machaut and Jean Froissart. They're kind of close contemporary writers of Chaucer in the 14th century. And we ask students to read these texts and to think about them alongside the Book of the Duchess when they're reading it. And what the students quickly see is that Chaucer is borrowing from Machaut. The form and structure of the Book of the Duchess is taken from Machaut. And he also borrows many lines from it. He's kind of doing a bit of a translation job as he goes along. And some students find it quite useful to think about that. But one of the main things we think about in our teaching of the dream visions is linked more to Froissart's text here, and which links to Chaucer's depiction of his narrators, his narrative personas. Something that is kind of central to all of Chaucer's writings that our students kind of find quite interesting. And what they see if they start reading Froissart alongside the Book of the Duchess is they begin to see how Chaucer is both borrowing from Froissart and also deviating from it. So both narrators are kind of restless, sleepless, they're suffering from insomnia, they're kind of these voices of despair. Chaucer is also changing certain things about which make it much more appropriate to the text that he's writing. There's elegy, there's a sense of kind of structural parallels that he creates by changing some of the features of his own. So our students find it quite useful to think about how Chaucer is using his sources, both in terms of what's borrowing, but also how he's changing things to suit perhaps the purpose of why he's writing. So that's some of the things that kind of we're doing in our seminars at UCL level. Other texts that I've mentioned just briefly would be, and some of these might be quite useful to you with your teaching at A level, something like The Romance of the Rose. This is a 13th century dream vision poem, extended sort of allegory of love that was hugely influential, informed the way many medieval writers were writing about the dream vision genre, completely pervasive. Students enjoy it because they find that these motifs and conventions that are being employed in The Romance of the Rose occur throughout Chaucer's writing. Not just in the dream visions, though, in something like The Lover's Tale, and that depiction of January's garden, that enclosed garden, where Chaucer is sort of inverting that, the idealised tradition and playing with it there. So it's kind of a nice, useful point that you can use elsewhere. We also look at Troilus, as I said, and we use that edition at the end. We point our students particularly to the Barney edition because that has the the translation of the Philosopher on one side and edition of Chaucer's Troilus, and you can see where Chaucer has added in his own stuff or deviating from his text. So it is quite a close parallel, but there are big chunks where Chaucer's adding in lots of philosophical material that is not in the Italian text. So that's one way we're kind of pointing students to sources material and getting them to think about what Chaucer's doing, how he's working. I could say lots more about that, but I won't. I'm going to move on. And I'm just going to say a bit about Chaucer's own contemporaries, his English contemporary writers. Now, the first authors that probably spring to mind are those like the Gawain poet, William Lanningham, the author of Piers Plowland, stuff off the year there, John Gower, also wrote works of different languages, but one in English is called the Confessio Amantis. Now, Gower in particular serves as a useful reference point when we're thinking about Chaucer, particularly the Canterbury Tales. And that's because the Confessio Amantis is, like the Canterbury Tales, a compendium of stories. It also, quite importantly, contains quite a number of analogues of tales that we find in the Canterbury Tales. So it's the same kind of Gower's reworking or version of the tale that we find in Chaucer. And one example that I just wanted to point you to was this one. It's the Tale of Florent, which is an analogue of the Wife of Bath's tale. You can access this online through the Net's website. It's very easy to find through Google. Garrick is writing the same sort of time as Chaucer, and it's possible that his text is from the same thing, that he and his and Chaucer's text share the same source, but I think that's still unknown really or debated. But they do very much follow the same narrative. A knight has to answer the riddle of what women most desire. You know it well, I'm sure. Now, it's quite productive, I think, to read The Wife of Bath alongside something like this, because by doing that, what students are able to discover is the ways in which Chaucer is changing this narrative in a way perhaps to make it more appropriate to or speak to some of the concerns the wife talks about in her prologue. I think this is quite enjoyable work, kind of looking at these texts side by side. I'm not going to dwell too much on it because I could say a lot about the ways in which these texts differ. But what I would say is that the wife's tale is much more female-centric than Garrow's version. The knight, who is obviously conventionally a chivalric figure, is completely unchivalric and unheroic in the wife's tale. He's judged by an exclusively female court. The lovely lady occupies the moral centre of that tale, in contrast to something like this where Florent occupies the moral centre. So there's interesting things going on. If you're interested in analogues and versions, the different versions of stories, you should definitely go and look at this resource, Sources and Analogues of the Canterbury Tales, in 2 volumes. It includes lots of sources, direct sources, so in something like The Wife of Bath, we've got all those excerpts from Jerome, the Ephrates, but also analogues too. So it's a really useful source to know about if you wanted to show students other material that Chaucer is drawing alongside the main text. I should end just by talking a bit about other women's voices. Now, obviously, The Wife of Bath is a literary creation, but her voice is in some ways one of the loudest of female voices that rings out from the medieval period, perhaps. But she does sit alongside other works or voices by female writers, and I'm thinking here of 2 in particular, first of all, that is Julia Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. Now, these 2 writers are the first English women to be identified as authors who are writing in English. They're often described as medieval mystics. And their 2 texts are very different from each other in terms of genre and style, and tone, I think, is also one thing to throw in there. But both of them, both Julian and Marjorie, are sharing in their accounts their kind of divinely inspired experiences and their accounts of their visions that they've received from God, from the divine. So you can just tell by just my quick summary of what these 2 texts are about and what they're doing, that they are obviously very, very different to The Wife of Bath's prologue and tale. They're doing different things, they're about different things. But nonetheless, both these authors are aware of their gender, and they both seek to defend their act of writing in quite a similar way to The Wife of Bath to some extent. They're not doing this by asserting their own kind of independent authority, like the wife does right from the start of their prologue. What they're doing instead is kind of claiming a sort of divine authorization from God that gives them their right to speak, but their right to write in this case. So there's some interesting, and you'll take, by introducing students to this, one is going in quite a different direction, but there are interesting things one can do by comparing this material, I think. Something a bit closer to home when it comes to finding parallels to the wife's words would be something like the work of Christine de Pizan, who's a very prolific French courtly poet to the end of the 14th century into the 15th century. Christine's works, not just this one I've got here, but others of them, devote quite a lot of space to kind of championing a defence of women. And she also, like The Wife of Bath, takes on the kind of view of women, the anti-feminist view of women that's perpetuated by male clerics. Christine isn't sort of seeking to overturn social structures, though, like the wife is doing in her prologue. She's instead seeking to kind of disprove misogynistic things by, disproving that women are all immoral. This kind of claim that's got formed by clerics. She does this in this work here, in the City of Ladies. And it's worth I mean, there's lots of the things that Christine said in this work resonate with some of the arguments put forward by the Wife Macbeth. In some ways, it's quite striking. I think what I would say about Christine's this work is that if Christine were here with us, that'd be a fine thing. I don't think she would say that the Wife of Bath was a virtuous woman. My sense is that she would not categorise the Wife of Bath in that way. But I think there are definitely interesting things one can do if you put them side by side. I haven't really ventured in this avenue in my own teaching, but it's something that I'm quite keen to explore. I don't know if anyone else at university level has done this. I'll be interested to know about it. Lastly, I just touched on these other things that I thought might be useful before I end. If you're interested in learning more about language and working with Chaucer's language, we do a lot of that with our students. This is a really good book to look at. It has passages that are broken down, that are analysed, that are thought about from a kind of grammatical as well as linguistic, thinking about word choice, things like that. It's really a really useful resource. As is this, actually, if you're interested in thinking about merchants or the Wife of Bath as a seamstress or plebeian and a businesswoman, I guess, too. Whichever program is really useful to get a slightly different take on their role in a historical context. You've probably all heard of Remington's Wife of Bath's literary biography, which is, I think, a really useful way of thinking about how this, particularly the Wife of Bath herself, travels through time as a kind of literary figure. I'm definitely out of time, I think, so I'll stop. Thanks so much.
Okay, come and take your seats. We're going to get started with our next session around Chaucer and creative practice. So we've got about 45 minutes for this session, and we're going to start thinking about how we can get engaged with Chaucer creatively, how we might begin to dismantle some of the barriers we talked about this morning. I'm really conscious in the picture that Chris gave us of teaching Chaucer in schools at the start of the day. He was talking about a model that really privileges knowledge over skills, that is about delivering knowledge, lecture style from the front of the classroom. And I think this afternoon we're going to be trying to kind of break that apart a bit and thinking about more active and creative ways in. And in this session to be thinking about creative practice and also the ways that Chaucer is in very lively and productive and sometimes surprising dialogue with contemporary poetry. It is a real privilege to be joined by our two guests who both have a deep understanding of creative engagement with Chaucer, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. Just to tell you a bit about the format of the session, we will be having a conversation and an appearance of poetry that engages with medieval literature, and then hopefully there'll be time to think about, do some questions from you at the end. So some introductions. First of all, me. I'm Catherine Clark, and I'm a professor here in the Institute of Historical Research. So I'm a professor of history, but until this point in my career, I was actually always in English literature. And I'm a medievalist. And my colleagues knew that I was going to do this, but I'm going to do a little product placement. See, Alfred laughing at me at the back. So I have a new book out, A History of England of 25 poems, which has got some chapters that are inspired by medieval poems, that use poems as ways to moments in the past. There's a Chaucer chapter there. And I'd love to see teachers responding to it, because really each chapter is a kind of adventure in close reading of a poem. And you can listen to bits of it on BBC Sounds at the moment as well. Much more importantly, I will introduce our guests in this session. So first of all, Caroline Bergwell, who is, as I'm sure many of you know, an award-winning poet, performer and artist who works across languages, media and art forms. Her books include Middle English, 2011, Drift, 2015, and Alison Sings, 2019, each engaged in reworkings of various medieval texts and contemporary contexts. She's Global Professorial Fellow at Queen Mary University of London. And another little plug, this absolutely brilliant new book from Art Humanities Press, hot off the press, I believe.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
2 years ago. So I have to tell you that is scorching shots. Caroline Bergwell's Medievalist Poetics, Migratory Texts and Trans-Historical Methods. And I've just looked inside, it is absolutely gorgeous. Probably one to encourage your library to buy, because, prices of academic books
but I think we'll make this available to have a look at the end of the session. And our other guest, it's a real delight to have with us Laura Varnum, who is lecturer in Old and Middle English Literature at University College, Oxford, and she's co-founder of the Guild of Medievalist Bakers, definitely hearing more about that this afternoon, and a practising poet. She's a specialist in medieval literature, but also in Daphne du Maurier and kinds of things. Her current poetry projects are inspired by the women of the Old English epic Beowulf, so going even further back, and her 15th century mystic Marjorie Hare, and she uses creative methods and more in the classroom with her students. So let's see where the conversation takes us. But I'll start with you, Caroline. So can you tell us a little bit about what brought you here? What led you to working with medieval literature and Chaucer particularly in brings to practice?
Yeah, absolutely. It started through an invitation. I do a lot of work across different environments, and invitations are often the ways that sort of start putting pressure on my own practice. And I was invited by David Wallace and Charles Bernstein, an American New York poet, to deliver some Chaucer-based poems at the Chaucer Society Congress in 2006. And this led me to really think about, well, how would I do this? So I'm sure we'll get into this a bit later on, so I'm not going to go into too much detail now. However, the way I did it was literally to first approach the text on the outside. The riverside, I just decided after a while that since I didn't know how to write this thing, that the best way to do it was to take something that runs through the entire tale, but it's a common denominator, and it's food and drink. So the first tale that I wrote is called an coastal tale, and I'm just going to read a tiny little paragraph of that. I wrote 4. I'm not going to take you through all of them, but I thought it was an interesting starting point since you're talking about teaching, and I did a lot of this whole idea of not knowing how to proceed. So this is what I did. I went through the tale, and I ended up with 7 pages of food and drink. The fruit of every taler is for to säga. De äter en drinker en danser en synger en klarar. De sopen en de steker. En drinken every stom ölen at the bästa. Now let us sit and drink and make us failure, and let us dine as soon as that ye may. Let us hear a messa and go within the city's doom. They sopen out by day, and to the dinner faster they sped, and go within with him to dine, to come to dinner, and thus I let the hen eat and drink and play, and on we go. And I find that they all get very drunk, as you remember from the tales, and that's I've managed to put that in here as well. And then slowly I managed to get involved in trying to think about narratives that I might myself be engaged with, and so I went through some more individual pieces and ways of writing, ways of translating. But the one I'm going to read today is the one that was perhaps the second piece that I did, which is based on the night tale, and is the section on the funeral, and it's called the Not Tale, Funeral. The great labor of appearance served the making of the pyre, but how, nor how also, how they shall not be told, nor how the gods, nor how the beasts and the birds, nor how the ground aghast, nor how the fire first with straw, and then with dryer, and then with greener, and then with gold, and then. Now how a sight is laid like this, nor what, nor how, nor what she spat, nor what was her desire, nor what jewels went the fire, nor how some threw there, and some there, and cups full of wine and milk and blood into the food, into the fire, nor how 3 times, and 3 times with, and 3 times how, and how that, nor how, nor who, I cannot tell, nor can I say, but shortly to the point I turn, and give my thaler, and then.
It's fascinating, I think, particularly following the conversations that we've been having already today, to hear you talk about how not knowing and not knowing where to begin actually offered you a kind of a creative point of entry into engaging with the Chaucer. And I think what I'm really struck by, hearing me read aloud, I'm sure you all were struck by this, is the way that that voice, it's kind of Middle English meeting Scandinavian, okay, meeting Modern English, okay. So it's this kind of melting pot of language, and I'd love to talk some more about this, about finding a voice for ourselves, maybe for others in the literature that we're engaging in, and particularly, again, I'm thinking back to our conversation this morning about how we meet the language. Is it about needing to look up every word and understand every word? And what I was so struck by hearing that, Caroline, is that in poetic language, it's about so much more than meaning, isn't it? It's about sound worlds and feeling and encountering that, which is really beautiful. So can you say a little bit more about how the kind of the linguistic resources, the stylistic resources of the Middle English are helping you, and the other languages you're drawing on, are helping you form a kind of voice?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to think about Chaucer as an author that one would read aloud. So one would be listening to Chaucer. And that for me as a contemporary poet is not, and as a contemporary artist, it's not always what I do either. You know, like I'm also in the silent world of graphic work or recorded sound, but not necessarily my own voice always. But for this, I thought, hang on, if we're going to tap into a poetic work that sort of for me makes sense in relation to Chaucer, it would be about making it feasible to hear. And so that's why I was looking for ways of working that are both seem complex when I first got to them, but get quite schematic and simple once you hear it. Because you hear those patterns that I did, which are literally mimicking, copying out that section of the funeral in The Knight's Tale. So literally trying to go back to the medieval form of aloudness and of community as my way of addressing the language. And then you move into all sorts of other aspects, but that has remained, even in the book length Addison, has remained one of the principles. One way or another, even if it's demanded or not, you've got to be able to deliver or perform or be setting it up in a sense of community. So that is perhaps the first answer, and therefore you've got to stick to that to the end. You know, so. Yeah.
I think that thinking across the textual and the oral is also something we've already been talking about, right? And the power of bringing medieval literature and language to life in classrooms and kind of speaking aloud. And I'm really struck by the way you touched on ideas of kind of giving it a new sense of inhabiting a kind of community, building a community and audience around the text, which I think is a really nice connection to some of what you're doing, Laura, this idea of speaking aloud and finding points of connection with the language, even if it's quite unfamiliar, quite difficult language, and you're taking us even further back. So I think some of the teachers in the room will have experience teaching maybe some Old English, maybe with kind of year 7s, year 8s, and history of the language. You might have some experience with that. But you've been working with Old English with Beowulf. Can you talk to us about one of your poems there?
Yes, absolutely. Hearing you talk, Caroline, about community, I think that's so important. I think that's so important, and performance, and bringing in an audience, because that's what both Chaucer is already built into the text, baked into the text, and the Beowulf poet has done that too. So I'm working on 2 projects at the moment. One is poems in the voices of the women in the Old English epic Beowulf. As many of you may well know, that's only one woman speaks in Beowulf, that's Queen Welfeal. She has 2 speeches, nobody speaks back to her. Gwendolen's mother, who is the second antagonist that Beowulf faces. I'm not saying monster, I'm saying antagonist. She doesn't get a voice, so what I started to do was to write poems in her voice. I have a sequence of those poems. Gwendolen's mother writes back. I'm going to cover those in a moment. And Gwendolen's mother is one of the women who is particularly, she's represented as silent, troublesome, marginalised. And what I really want to channel in my revoicings is the American feminist poet Adrienne Rich talks about rewriting as a form of revision.
and that when we revision a text, when we enter an old text from a new critical direction, that particularly for women, and also say for other marginalised groups, in Rich's terms, to do that is an act of survival. It's a way of pushing back against the ways in which we've been marginalised and controlled by patriarchal structures, by all kinds of other structures. So I very much came to these poems wanting to open up new voices, wanting to draw in different audiences who might not feel that Beowulf is a text that has spoken to them before, but also to mimic and to push back against the sound of Old English. It's literative poetry, it has amazing kind of sound patterns. So I'll read a couple of passages so you get a sense of it. So many of you probably know Beowulf opens with the word "quat," and "quat" is almost untranslatable. It's been translated in all sorts of different ways as "lo," "listen," "behold," "grow." What Bertie Wooster version of Beowulf, "grow" by Maria de Van Hedley in her most recent one. So what I'm going to do I'll give you the original in Old English, and then there'll be a little bit of audience participation. So obviously Beowulf opens with "What we God in Ea Targum, Theod Cunninga Fringa Funan, Hutha Echthalingas Ellen Fremdon," which means, listen, lo, behold. We have heard, we're already in there, we have heard of the Spear Danes in days gone by, of the glories of the kings of that people, how the noblemen did courageous deeds. So the first thing I wanted to do in my Grendel's Mother poems was to rewrite that opening. So on 3, I'm going to get you to all shout "quat," kind of fairly loudly, but let's not break the sound system. So "quat" on 3. 1, 2, 3. Quat! Quat. Indeed, we have heard of the Danes. We never stop hearing about them, those death and glory Danes, them, their demons, and their glory days. Me, I prefer a little variation. If you'd like to, listen. The hall door is open. The mere wife awaits her welcome. So that's my opening, and I'll just give you one in Grendel's Mother's voice, which hopefully will take us into some of the ways in which these poems bring in our own voices, which I think is so important for students. So this is a poem called "Grendel's Mother Addresses the Author." It's got one piece of Old English in it, but Mark Stapper, so Mark Stepper or boundary stalker, both Grendel and his mother are described as people on edges of the whole society. You'll hear lots of alliteration going on in here, some quotations from published poets, Seamus Heaney, in there for his our thoughts on what he thinks about Grendel's Mother. And then there's a teeny little bit of Northern English from my own dialect at the end, the word "nesh." Will come clear. So Grendel's Mother addresses the author. For all your bluster, warrior poet, your puffed up preening, your sword swagger and shield shuffling, you still won't look at me. Petrifying people. That's not my style. It's not my stare that needles your braggadocio. Anyway, you started it, edging me out, making me your mail stapper, your boundary stalker, border controller. I never wanted to shoulder those lines. You cattle me into the corners of your compounds, tuck me into the bottom drawer of your word hoard, shushed and smothered by your fabrications. Water witch, she-wolf of the deep, troll down, give over. Don't be so nesh. If you don't know what nesh means, it's a word from Old English and it means wimpy. Don't be such a wimp.
But it's a northern dialect.
And it's meaning dialect and soft
comments and much
Yeah.
the same, yeah. Which kind of, and I really love that, and I definitely want to talk more about voices. And you mentioned Heaney, and it makes me think of in his introduction to his translation of Beowulf, he talks about trying to find his right of way into the text as a translator, and for him, it's some of those linguistic resonances with his Northern Irish dialect, where he sees those kind of points of of affinity. And I think what you really show in that work is that these acts of making are kind of, I don't know what to ask you. Would you describe it as a kind of creative translation? Is that how you understand your practice? Or one of the ways?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Because translation is it's a crossing over. It's a moving of something both from one language to another, but from one place to another. And I do see my work as a kind of temporal crossing, as a crossing into a kind of female voice from a very male poem. Which is not to say that I don't think the male poet is interested in women. I think he is, and there's all sorts of things that come out of that interest, but also a kind of claiming of the poem for myself that this is me speaking through these women and bringing. Nesh is something my mum would say. If I said I was cold, she'd say I would put a jumper on, don't be Nesh. Any road comes from my granddad's dialect. My grandparents, of course, have been a pottery transit contract, and we'd be chatting and he'd just say, well, any road, and then he'd turn on to something else. So there's little kind of ways of, I think, kind of putting ourselves into these texts, which we'll hopefully talk about later on, is I think can be really empowering for students.
Yeah, it's definitely come back to that. And I think, what you're saying about translation as well, both of you, and your kind of these acts of very creative, very free translation, I'm seeing these parallels with Chaucer as well. Chaucer, of course, models for us how a kind of very creative translation can be about being subversive, can be about sparring with the text, can be about that kind of playful and sometimes spiky dialogue with the text. So let's talk more about voices, because I think one of the things that really speaks across both of your work is finding new ways to voice poems, is revoicing figures, characters, speakers, is writing into silences, is telling the stories from different perspectives. You've already given us some examples from your work, Laura, and we'll come back to some more, I think. Caroline, can you tell us a little bit more about how those concepts of voice and voicing speak to you, and how you thought about revoicing, particularly, we've got Alison Sings on the table in front of us. Alison, of course, is the wife of Bath, and she's his wife of Bath.
Yeah. Well, you talk about, I can't really tell, you talk about Chaucer in general, the practice of translation also being a sort of back and forth in medieval time in a way that is much more formalized now. So you'll have a lot of it that's already direct translation that features then big concept to Syrian text. And so I think part of what is happening here is to reclaim that way of taking the freedom, taking the texts that are there to literally sort of help oneself to it. It's there, let's help ourselves to it. And it doesn't matter if it's unclean or if it's even misunderstood, might be something else, but at least then it just literally is language in making. And I suppose for me, so the polyvocality of Chaucer is really, I think, important to maintain. So that's either because we revoice in different ways, so we start writing in different ways for different characters, but also that the languages of the different tales carry different histories of the language itself, or ways of thinking about the language. Like, for example, the way you talk is something that I'm also very busy working with, especially with the wife of Bath, the silencing of voices. And therefore the way in which one can re-gender or rethink aspects of the wife of Bath once you take that freedom, to think, to apply some of these narratives. So I think there's two different things. There's a polyvocality, which is enjoying that diversity, enjoying that inclusiveness of a great range of voices. And then there's also, I think, in relation to which narratives one would pick up on and why, and that might be more in my agenda as a poet and as a, for example. Another thing that I think is really important, that I know is really important to me in my practice in general, is the fact of thinking about Chaucer's English as a language in progress as well, and to think about English today as a language that's radically changing. And that is also, I think, a point of entry, so that I know that I can work with Chaucer today in that acknowledgement that there are great historical shifts and political shifts that are happening through the language, to its place in the world, which it's at the point of, again, perhaps it was at the point of trying to assemble itself in Chaucer's time, but still wider, but now it's at the point of tearing itself apart. And what do we do with that? How do we think about the new Englishes, if you like, that are making up contemporary English here on the islands, but also elsewhere? And so I think there's a sense of relocalizing English, which is really interesting. The dialects, the patois that one can hear in London are fascinating bits of language that can be used. And again, since this is a bit of a day about thinking more on the ground, also that can be used by your students. What is their language and how can they use that in relation to their narratives? So I thought that whole sense of invoking a spoken literature, basically, and in the context of great political shifts and great cultural shifts, of remaking of this whole idea of national and post-national, gendering, sexuality, trans-identity coming into play. How does that take place in the language today? It makes it an extremely rich field for me to be working with. And so I keep it nearly as, like Alison, I went into the Wife of Bath in the prologue mainly, in great detail, but then I come out of it and she is Vivian Westwood, she is all those things that have also been associated with the Wife of Bath today. When they talk about Westwood, they often say either she was the queen or she was the Wife of Bath, because she played those different roles. So it's also that love of fashion in Addison that allows me to go into contemporary fashion. So, making those jumps, and so anyway, that's I think I'm sitting off just for now, but I hope that starts placing it in a little bit. That's great. I think
Can I pick up on the sort of political context? I think that's so crucial, and particularly from one of the ways in which Chaucer's storytelling framework is being used today. I don't know if, and probably some of you in the room know the work of the Refugee Tales project, which is a really, really important, fantastic project working with immigrants who've been detained in this country, and Refugee Tales walks. So they have a series of walks, walking with immigrants, but they've also published these amazing books of refugee tales, and they are the tales that refugees have told about their journeys to this country, about their experiences in this country, and it's part of a political project because of indefinite detention in this country. And it's a project that enables marginalised community voices to be heard, for people to then be able to self-advocate for themselves within kind of legal structures in this country. So it has a really fundamental and crucial political role to say, well, here are some texts, Beowulf, Chaucer, male-dominated patriarchal might be tied up with national identity in all sorts of ways, but when you show how they can be pulled apart, changed, that actually means that tales are all about voices originally anyway. They're all about retelling stories. It gives people the possibility to use their own voices, and in a kind of really weird way, not to do kind of psychoanalysis on myself, but I started writing these Beowulf poems actually at a moment in my academic career and personal life where I felt I'd become very voiceless. I lost my voice. I was really struggling with my writing, and actually Grendel's mother's voice kind of brought me back to myself when I'd written a lot of poetry as a teenager and an undergraduate, and going back to that voice, it was as though it was a part of myself that I was able to re-access, that had a kind of boldness about it, it gave me something. And I think there really is real power in our ability to use these voices for ourselves, but also for our communities. I think that's crucial. It's really interesting.
I just wanted to answer to that, because I think that is such a wonderful thing that you said now about how another's voice, a literary voice, has allowed you to re-access your own sort of creativity and find your own personal power again through that. And I think that's part of the question of revoicing as well. How that can actually, certainly Alison, For me, Alison was more of a bully. Like, she kept on saying, you need to go further, that's not enough, you know, so it was a bit like that. However, that made me bold, so she's gone, you know, really out there. But I think it's really important, that aspect, how I can use those texts and those voices, perhaps even more than the text, as things that can help us also move through. When we face moments of losing a sense of purpose, or whatever it might be, you know, that you find. I think that's brilliant.
And there's a lovely little, if you go to Refugee Tales website, there's a wonderful piece of writing by Alice Smith, who's one of the patrons, and she talks about the way in which storytelling is an act of profound hospitality and an act of generosity. And I think that's really wonderful. She talks about storytelling always as a welcoming in to the days. Yeah. But it's also, I think, an act of, the act of generosity is in the listening. I think, you know, we can all, in our present moment, be better listeners to other people's stories. And I think that's also what it's inviting us to do, whatever someone's perspective might be, to try and listen to it, empathise with it, and try to connect with it. Particularly, or even more so, when those perspectives might be really challenging.
I was part of Refugee Tales too, so I was invited to be part of the process. And if I can just go into that, because it is very powerful. It's very relevant for this whole idea of perhaps the tales could be about that, actual retellings, and that's what they're doing in their project. But what happens is that because of the situation, the person you are sort of dialoguing with and that you're telling their story, is in the system, hoping to get granted refugee status. You've got to be extremely careful about keeping things extremely anonymous. You have to delocalize, you know, the voice. Some of the stories cannot be told. Some of the, you know, you really have to. And I thought that, well, so it was extremely powerful. The responsibility, the responsibility that you then feel for those tales, and how you might be able to be, you know, retelling. And the fact that they're part of that political system at the moment, of course, with infinite detention, is really important as well. But I just think on the point of retelling, that there's, when you said about the listening, that there's something about that we don't listen in a preemptive way, but we listen without knowing. You listen without being able to know, and you gotta take that on board as perhaps the way you can rewrite. You know, and so, because often we have already heard and we're already answering back while we're listening. But perhaps to place ourselves completely in that positioning where we can't, that is when the listening starts. And that might also be the approach to some of these languages. Because you can see even the way carrying that pen with the way it's written. It's exciting to see the way it's written. And it could be from a point of, oh my God, what does that do?
Yeah, I've got my whacked badge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think the listening, and especially also that listening that genuinely has to listen, does not know, and has to then piece things together, but very slowly.
I wonder if that resonates with some of the teachers in the room, the idea that maybe we listen in a different way if it is something that we're at a space of not knowing, for something that is unfamiliar, that it's different. I was going to ask you both a very kind of weirdly basic question about why we should be reading medieval literature now, but you've answered that in beautiful ways. And what I'm really struck by is that I think sometimes the language of relevance, when it's brought to Chaucer or Beowulf or medieval literature, can feel a little bit reductive, and like it's really sort of missing the point. You've been using the language of power and powerful, that's the word. And I think that really that does speak in really inspiring ways about the ways this kind of can connect with really important questions and conversations today, and be very kind of inclusive. While we're sort of staying with people we sing, Laura, I wanted to ask you to read a particular poem, because earlier, Natalie, you were mentioning other authors we might think about alongside Chaucer, and I noticed you mentioned Marjorie Ken. Can you wave if you know of Marjorie Ken? Mrs. Ward? Oh, look at that full.
And that's also
So you've been doing some thinking around Marjorie Ken, and could you read us this very short poem?
yes. So the technique's a little bit different with the Marjorie Kemp work, but I'm not going to we'll maybe talk about that afterwards. So this is a short little poem. As I'm sure you do all know, Marjorie Kemp had 14 children. So this poem is called Medieval Mystic Marjorie Kemp in Tesco. Of course she's one of those shoppers who thinks she won't need a trolley, but halfway round her basket's on the lino and she's losing tins of custard powder and baby formula and she's crushing the body and blood of Christ under her arm while John Jr. tucks into a donut she hasn't paid for yet. And there's an unexpected item in the bagging area and it's Thomas again wanting to talk about his glory, and she just wants to get home and put the kids in front of CBs to keep them occupied before he starts on again about how lonely it is in heaven. She clutches a multi-pack of paper towel and its whiteness gives her hope.
Well, so I happen to know that poem kind of arrived within 7 minutes, is that right? Tell us a little bit about it.
It did. So I worked with an amazing poet called Rishi Dastardai. If you don't know his work, look him up. It's published by Nine Arches Press. It's fabulous. And I was at a workshop that Rishi was running, and Rishi's kind of amazing technique is to get him to write a poem in 7 minutes. Because seven minutes is the perfect amount of time. It's not so short you can't write anything. It's not so long you start to freak out and you get stressed. 7 minutes, you've got to write something. And Rishi also works in advertising. We've done lots of these 7 minute activities. And right at the end, he said, okay, on your next 7 minute poem, he gave us a list of brand names. So we put them on the PowerPoint. He said, you've got to write a poem with one of these brand names. And I thought, why? I was thinking, Beowulf, how am I going to connect this with brand names? I can't really think of anything. But I was also doing this Marjorie Kemp work, and I suddenly thought, Marjorie Kemp, Tesco, go. And it pretty much just sort of emerged. As soon as I thought about Marjorie Kemp doing her shopping in Tesco, there she was, and I knew what kind of shopper she was.
I love it. Well, that's a really good concrete tip for classic writing. 7 minutes. And Tesco.
You could write something in 7 minutes, and it really doesn't matter what it is. I think that's the other thing, kind of taking the pressure off and writing something that was so kind of bonkers to think. I've done a little bit with Marjorie Kemp, written about a poem called Marjorie Kemp Barbie. It's like the Barbie movie, but to do something really what actually took the pressure off. So, put the wife at bath at the playground or it must have been that's right.
Yeah, I think Caroline, that's new work as well, bringing together. Sometimes these kind of seemingly quite incongruous elements, the modern and the medieval, or the kind of that's very much there.
Yeah, it's a way of not separating the times. We don't know really. We don't know how it actually feels in medieval. It's sort of so. Why not feel what we know from that perspective and then take on what we don't know also from that position? So what you do with Tesco is exactly that. It allows for that, basically, that time becomes more like a figure 8, that you literally allow for that. And I think that becomes more gymnastic that allows for inventiveness and pleasure and, to also come into play. So so Addison expected a lot of that. She's both elsewhere and she's suddenly very much here and then even beyond. So because it also allows the future, then you move into retrofuturism, you can really go back and then move forward and beyond, and why not take that on?
I love the way you use the word pleasure. The pleasure and playfulness are really coming to the fore here, which I know is something we always try to embrace and foster in our classroom context. We've got a few minutes to bring in some questions from the room. I did promise to try to do that if we had time. So does anyone want to bring a question to Laura and Caroline about their practice, about their own rate of engagement with Chaucer, their tips, their ideas for inspiration? I think so much of what you said is about kind of ways that we to give ourselves permission to work with this material and then find our ways. And I love, use that language, use the word unclean paradigm, which obviously resonates in Menelaus. You're talking about, the midden and sort of getting messy and dirty with language, and something that's kind of in flux and is a kind of sealed and finished and hermetic that has all these frayed edges that we can catch hold of.
These sounds in such linguistics, it's not such as language as registers. Thinking of registers as registers. So,
Registers rather than language.
yeah, the language is a kind of nation state mythology, but the madness we're synchronized. And the what people actually do in the real language, in the language, are not registers. This is associated with Lambronna, who grew up in Belgium and had the actual language of the books was saying. No academic language and literature. Anyway, it just it's the thing I found with it. It's a really enjoyable sessions. It's that way in which when you're working with old texts and you're working with what hasn't been standardised and shaped and so relief like motion seek processes of standard language. That just gives a few more possibilities of getting under the edge of it, and I think now we're living on a time of post-acadization and micrological evaluation and so on. It's particular concepts of it. Enjoy just
I like very much what you said about registers and this idea of sociolinguistics, that it's not languages, languages, and can only ever be languages. And even that, but if you break it down even further, because you move even further away from even regionalisms at that point.
See that Laura Wright's book about London Bridge and all those varieties that people access to untutored, on the move translation. And that's just reflects letters or what's something like that.
Absolutely. Brilliant.
Thank you. I think it's really important because a lot of this ties into the ways in which we think about and define the literary, what literature is. Because, when Tolkien writes his essay about translating Beowulf, he says there must be no colloquialisms and false modernity if you're to translate and not rewrite Beowulf. It's Tolkien, Tolkien is, of course, doing all this amazing adaptation, translation in that freer sense. But translation to Tolkien by Beowulf is a highly literary form, written in a very high-register, literary, poetic language, which it absolutely is. But when you translate it into modern English, I really like the translation by Edwin Morgan in the 1950s, where he said that all the literary quality and the archaism of Beowulf is still there. It's still got dragons and monsters and cups and funerals and ships and things. But a real translation needs to. He says something about communication must take place. The skin must tingle, and something about the soul kind of. It's not quite fizzy, but it has to kind of buzz with the original poetry. You've got to have that in there. And by allowing all of these other languages and dialects and idiolects and sociolects to come in, it is saying these poems are for everyone. They're not just for, the Oxford academic or for this community or for men, for white communities. It's saying it is fair. Really important.
Well, Patience like Barbie's Canterbury Tales is great like that, for bringing in such very, very rangy way, again, so many different voices from the Canterbury Tales
And we will look at a little bit of that in that section. Such a great trailer for us. We'll take a last question, I think, from you, Marianne.
Yes, we something like that fascinating about just opening up refugees in Bulgaria and at the same time and not being attracted and being sent down but it's I'm just wondering, I'm troubled by not troubled but it's like it's lying me, the specificity of values we very kind of finding a little bit of dialect and following that slowly. I remember doing similar things. Kind of read about the language. I'm wondering about the challenge of getting on and what's happening to language now presents to us when students are using it so frequently, and as we know, it presents a real problem for history and specificity. The data is correct, language is stop. We're living in 2022 when we don't actually know what human language sounds like anymore. So this isn't really a fully formed question, but how can we see this kind of practice of the delight, actually, what we're both discussing is talking about the leaders into the delight. It is that threatened by this kind of proliferation of computer-generated non-language. Sorry.
So Caroline, you talked about kind of almost like a hyper-localizing. You use that word, really localizing language and experience, and that's the opposite of what Gen AI does when we're describing it, which is levels, which is a kind of, broad, neutral
Yeah. It's as though, I don't know, because that's great, you don't know the answer. You don't have your question fully, and of course none of us have the answer, so this is just, wondering. And of course, it's on everybody's mind. It's, we work with language, so it's even more on our minds. And those of you who teach, even more, it used to be plagiarizing, and now it's not even that. It's sort of self-created in a way, so it's even, one step beyond. And I am wondering, though, about the politics that we are all engaged in. It's going to take a while before that materializes. However, this whole idea of the hyperlocal, trans-regionalism, a different sense of the national is definitely happening, we know it. And I'm just wondering whether AI, just a very quick thing, might be the new Latin at some point, or the new English of the 19th century. So a sort of all-invasive imperial language. And that within that, sorry to be so negative, but I have to say, we are being totally taken on a rapid course of untraining, reclaiming. Go to now. So, there's no time to absorb. So because of that, it feels like an I was actually said Louise, if you prefer, but like an invasive type of linguistic behavior, which we are supposed to socially immediately adapt to, therefore an occupying force, if you like, that has its own standards, so lots of things we can't say. That's explicit in America at the moment from so-called humans, but it's already in the machine. And so I'm just wondering, without being able to finish my thought, and that's something that we'll all do with time, whether it has to do with the hyperlocalism, the hand, your guilt, whether we have to genuinely, seriously, politically turn to the local, whether that's translocal, because that's what many of us share, but that might be a way to save our specificities as well, while still knowing that there is the big sort of machine. So of course it's totally unfinished and not even completed, but that's what I think is not.
I think it has to come back to our imagination, which is what AI cannot have. Our ability to make, so the Guild of Medievalist Makers that I've co-founded with two colleagues, where we're thinking about making textile arts, cartoons, all the kinds of stuff that we can make creatively. But I think it also, so in imagination, I think making, and I think empathy, I think emotional engagement. And one of the things that's so wonderful about Catherine's book and the event I went to Catherine did recently was thinking about poetry as a kind of engine of radical empathy and of emotional connection, something I don't get. Many of my poems are driven by an emotional response to a moment in Beowulf. There's a moment where, as many of you will know, Grendel was returned to his mother's mere. He's bleeding out as he gets there, and he dies there. And the Beowulf poet, it's the passage we do for translation commentary, and also the Beowulf poet takes great delight in describing the bloodthirsty quality of this moment, that the water is bubbling up with the gore of Grendel's blood. I've always found it deeply uncomfortable to read, to translate, to work on with students. I had a conversation with some students where, I said, well, this is Grendel's mother's home. How would you feel if your home was desecrated by the blood of your family? And that led into all kinds of enormous discussion. And then I wrote a poem about it because I thought, what, I feel upset, I feel quite angry on Grendel's mother's behalf, and so I wrote this kind of pushback against the Beowulf poet. So I think those are the things we have to channel. We have to say to our students, this is what you have that AI doesn't have. It doesn't have radical empathy, it doesn't have imagination, and it can't physically make it properly in a way that we can.
So we've got imagination, we've got making, we've got our own voices, we've got the local. That's a kind of an answer in a way to the kind of question that we're all still trying to thought about AI. I mean, this has been a little conversation, but I feel like it's taken us to some very, very big places. We have to wrap up now because we need to move on with the programme. But please can you join me in thanking our two amazing speakers, Laura Barnum and Caroline Birdmore.
Thank you very much to Alfred for inviting us to be here today, and Rebecca, who's supported our work through the English Association as well. So my name's Emily Wingfield, and we've come down from Birmingham today. My colleague Liv Robinson, coming from Solihull School, Stuart Hart, and we're going to tell you a little bit about a partnership we've had during the course of the last academic year, in which we might carry on. I did. So bigger and great things after that. So, yeah, that's what maybe it's useful to tell you a little bit about the background to this project. So, Liv and I, Liv in particular, she was in touch with Becky about setting up a hub with the English Association. What we wanted to do as part of that work is think about particular challenges that we felt we faced. So one of them at Birmingham and this small university is the lower uptake of medieval modules, sort of unfamiliarity of it, the difficulty of it, issues of relatability, which we've already touched on. And in our local context, we've got the challenge of a streamlined reduced curriculum since the time that I've been at Birmingham. So some of the questions we wanted to ask ourselves were, what role does medieval literature and culture play in the school curriculum, and what might the challenges and opportunities be of introducing it there? So that's sort of where we started, and we worked with 3 schools, Solihull School, which was quite today, Birmingham Academy, Bowell, or Regent's Work, and then Dara, and then there's some teacher CPD work at Tube Grange. We're not going to talk about those today, we're going to talk with students about what we did with his valuable students.
Yeah, so I'll give you a brief kind of outline of what we do at Solihull. I think it's worth, like Chris did earlier, giving you a sense of what our school context is. So Solihull School, it's a 3 to 18 co-educational independent school. It's selected, just south of Solihull, so south Birmingham. And then it was really interesting when Becky and Liv and Emily got in touch. It was really interesting because if I'm honest, we haven't done a great deal of medieval literature for a number of years for various reasons. So I thought, well, this is a really interesting kind of idea for us to do a little bit of collaborative work and see if we can perhaps pull some quite interesting things. So it's perhaps worth saying that the pupils' exposure to the medieval world at Solihull is perhaps limited mostly to their history lessons rather than the English classroom. The pupils study the medieval period as part of their history curriculum in year 7. They develop their critical appreciation of historical perspectives, methods used for historical inquiry. They're introduced to aspects of cultural, economic, political, religious, and social history of the period. And then they start to construct a timeline of significant events. For example, the Conquest, Black Death, Peasants' Revolt, murder of Thomas Becket. And then the work kind of culminates in a trip to Goodrich Castle, and also St Mary's Church in Chemically, which we saw earlier. And then there's also a trebuchet competition, which is quite good fun, and which is amazing fun actually. They do some fabulous kind of collaborative work with DT. But they do that in year 7. They do that in year 7, so when they're 11 or 12. They don't then touch upon the medieval period again until they're doing their GCSEs. They then study the history of medicine and they touch on the medieval period during that point. They don't study any medieval kind of history in their A-levels. So that's what happens in history. In terms of the English classroom, in Key Stage 3, that's where perhaps they have their greatest exposure to medieval literature. They may study in year 7, a number of beast fables, and then may study those alongside Animal Farm as part of a scheme of work on anthropomorphic tales. We also use the same text that Chris referenced earlier, which is a modern play script version of the Canterbury Tales. Also, I'm not a medievalist, I'm a Spencerian, so I'm quite interested in allegorical epic tales. So I do encourage the year 7s and year 8 to have a go at creating their own kind of allegorical epic tale. We get them to create their own map, and we encourage the students to create their own characters such as envy, jealousy, hatred, peace. And they create these, quite nice actually, these allegorical tales which take place over several lessons. But then they don't do anything in terms of medieval literature again until perhaps the sixth form. And I said perhaps the sixth form. So for those students who do study English at A level, there is a pre-1770 paper, and there is the option there to study the Merchant's Prologue and Tale. However, for the most part, the students probably study the poetry of John Donne or Rossetti. The teachers have choice as to what's taught. And yeah, for the most part, they will probably study John Donne or Rossetti, which is unfortunate. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that a number of my colleagues haven't necessarily got the expertise in medieval literature themselves. And what we're finding increasingly with teachers, ECTs who are coming into the profession, is that they've been able to navigate their way through their undergraduate studies without having to study Chaucer, without having to study any medieval literature. So perhaps they're less inclined to teach it when they come to schools. They feel as if they haven't got that knowledge. Also, interestingly, we spoke about some questions earlier. I think we're always kind of competing with some of the other subjects, such as politics or history. And therefore, when we're looking at recruitment at A level, the notion of saying you're going to be studying Chaucer, that potentially may put some of the students off. Even though when they do study Chaucer, they find it fascinating, they love it, and it's a great joy for them, and it's one of the most memorable parts of their A level. Nonetheless, when we have those conversations with the year 11s, when they come towards the end of their GCSEs, if you were to say that and it would be 15%, it's worth 15% of their A level, they would be studying Chaucer, it may put some of them off. So therefore, John Donne is the likely kind of go-to, but increasingly a number of my colleagues have chosen Rossetti because they feel that that's more accessible. And also a number of our students at Solid Hall, they've very much got their eyes on the next step. So they want to go to a Rotary University, they want to apply to UCL, they want to apply to various different places. And therefore they feel, or my colleagues feel, that if they are trying to get those A's or those A stars or those B's, perhaps it's more chance of doing that by studying Rossetti in the 1770 paper than what there is with Chaucer. So that's one of the problems. So in terms of us, yes, there is the option for them to study Chaucer at A level, and I've taught it in the past. One of my colleagues has taught it in the past. It's the Merchant's Tale, but there hasn't been a great deal of medieval literature. So therefore, when we had the opportunity to collaborate with the University of Birmingham, it was a fabulous opportunity. And as a result of this, I think it's really kind of conceptualised the way in which we may incorporate medieval literature into our studies. Not least because of the work that we've done at Key Stage 3, as we can explain shortly. We've done some work on medieval morality plays, and that will feed into the study of Inspector Pauls at Key Stage 4. So those ideas of morality plays and what they mean, framing some of those conversations, that will actually be very, very useful when the guys are studying. One thing, before we do talk about the kind of the detail, is that the students that collaborated with the university, they were our academic scholars. So they were the year 7 and the year 9 academic scholars. So as well as being head of English at Solihull, I'm also in charge of academic scholars. So rather than kind of upscale this, we thought we'd work with a small kind of sample of some of our brightest and most diligent students. So we had about 22 year 7 scholars, about 15 year 9 scholars, I think. So that's the school context.
Okay, so we started off, we did a day with both groups of students on campus together, both of us, and some other teachers as well came to chaperone students around. And we started off with a very, very brief kind of plenary session with Warrington where we just gave them like a whistle-stop tour, some of the highlights, trying, the going towards the Beowulf monsters, trying to make them sound as kind of engaging as possible in 10 minutes. And then we before we did any textual work, we split into the year 7 and the year 9, and we took them to do some hands-on work with medieval artefacts. So we have on campus at the Macabre Research Library, which is where our medieval manuscript collections are held, and it's just literally next door to our building. So you took groups instead of you and handled some manuscripts. And we also are very fortunate to have Barber Institute of Fine Arts as part of her campus as well, which is a sort of beautiful, miniature, small but amazing museum, effectively art gallery. And so I took groups into the art gallery and we looked at just 2 or 3 selected objects in there, and then looked carefully at those. And we followed that up after lunch, that was in the morning, and then after lunch we followed that up with sessions on the Canterbury Tales for the younger ones, which Emily led, and on the medieval morality play Every Man, which I led. We wanted them to kind of take something away and work on it in a way, and you were very keen for that to happen as well, weren't you, for them to kind of have something to get their teeth into after, rather than just doing these sessions. So we devised a competition, again, for both groups, slightly different. The Canterbury Tales competition, looking at the slide. Basically, they both involve creative writing. So for the Canterbury Tales one, they used creative writing, and then for my one on drama, they were writing a morality play. So the challenge was to create a portrait as a portrait in the general prologue. Let's write their own portrait for the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales for Emily's one, and then I asked them to write their own morality play, having looked at Every Man, to write a kind of couple of scenes on a kind of question or a topic of their choice. So that was what they had to do.
And then this year was the extra guidance you gave.
Yeah, that's right. So when we returned back to school, this was what we did with the year 7 students. So I meet with the academic scholars once a week, and we kind of framed the activity. So we went to university in November, I think it was, and so we said that they would have a couple of months to do this, and then they were going to submit it to you, weren't they? Then you were going to judge it. So we just put a few parameters in place here. So we said you're invited. It was a 3-night work reading. So they're invited to enter a creative writing competition, and the portrait must be at least 40 lines long. So there are certain parameters in place. We said it does not have to rhyme. Okay, it doesn't have to rhyme at all. But in order to capture a sense of rhythm and momentum of argument, we thought, right, okay, you've got to have between 8 and 12 syllables in each line. We also used, or rather encouraged them to kind of use Middle English vocabulary when they could, just try and give it a kind of an authenticity. And try and avoid writing about a famous person, try and write about a type of person, so teacher, doctor, judge, whatever. And then, as with the portrait, try and focus on appearance, mannerisms, personality. Now, in order to feed into this, we looked at a number of portraits. So I met with the guys a number of times, and we looked at a number of portraits, and we looked at them in Middle English. And they had the glossary. We spent quite a bit of time. I gave them a prep or homework, and I gave them a particular, whether it's the night, and they went away and they had a week to read it. using it lots during Middle English, and we came back and we discussed it, and then that informed what they then went and produced. And they had, as we said, I think it was about 2 months, wasn't it? And they did some fabulous things, as we'll see. They got the old tea bags out, and they did some brilliant stuff, and it was good fun. Some people embraced the Middle English vocabulary more than others, and we had some marvellous calligraphy. And I think what was really fabulous is, can we just go back a few slides to when Hugo's looking. Yeah, I mean, what was marvellous? I mean, that is priceless for young children to have the opportunity to go into the Cadbury Research Library, engage with those medieval manuscripts. That was marvellous. That's something that they will remember in 40 years' time. And the visual aspect of medieval culture, it was really brought to life. And we can see in what they produced, some more than others, that they really tried to engage with that visual culture. It was fabulous. So yeah, they had lots of fun, and hopefully it will mean that a number of those students will hopefully go on studying English at A level, and if they then go on to kind of study English at university level, they may opt to do medieval modules. That's what the hope is. I think what it's shown them is that medieval kind of culture, which is so different and unfamiliar to them, is actually very familiar. It speaks to them. It speaks to some of the complexities of the human condition. So it was marvellous.
And I think that's true of this actually as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
That being they sort of came into the museum thinking, well, just a little bit, but they found that they were able to find things to talk about, to decode, and suddenly these weird objects, portraits that they were looking at, they started to become legible to them, and they were sort of, that was not because I was just telling them, it was because I was asking them, what can you see? And then they found they could see things, and they became interested in what they could see. And I think that they knew the answers actually, they were
And I think you're encouraging how to kind of read the symbols of these images, weren't you? In a way that they hadn't there.
And that is such a special portrait, because it's the earliest known British portrait of a Muslim sitter. Who's the ambassador of Morocco, I think, and so was an embassy to Elizabeth. And of course, lots of these students are from non-white backgrounds, so there is also a sense of kind of including that experience as well.
We've got that was competition. We're not sure. A few examples of the tea bag in action. And I have done, I think, something a little bit for me. I got the visual, we've got visual treated like, because I got
tea bags.
But it was, this parcel, I say, one of Stuart's colleagues is a very good friend of mine, so she delivered the parcel that came. I opened this out, and I was just absolutely bowled over by what these are year 7s, they're 11, and the particular girl who'd done that one worked it out. This student decided to, he typed it, but the quality of the work was phenomenal. It wasn't just in terms of the language, but it was getting the creativity that came out, the effort that went into it, but getting into that, this one about a psychologist in particular, I think just certain things that his fingers twitched as they wrote in air, lost thoughts and whispers, none durst to read. His voice aside, it crept as wind through trees and a shudder through the listening souls. And they kind of, it gave me the tingles reading this, because they really kind of encapsulated some of the sort of work, the darker areas of the soul that psychologists might go into. So that's for that, and then we had manuscripts as well.
Yeah, so I'd done the session, like I say, on Every Man, and we acted out a scene, and we talked about allegorical performance and kind of how do you perform an abstraction. So the thing I really wanted them to do was to write thinking about how would you differentiate these different allegorical abstractions so they don't all sound the same. So when you're performing, an audience can tell who is who, and it doesn't just sound like a kind of hodgepodge of voices. And I mean, and some of them were just absolutely hilarious. They're very, very, very funny, very witty. They've gotten, a lot of them went for some really quite deep ethical dilemmas, quite kind of thorny, and which fair enough, because every man is a play about death, and it's how to die and how to die well and what happens after we die. And these are not easy questions for teenagers, they're not easy questions for adults either, but this was one of the ones that got a prize, and one of the things I loved about it was the way this character narcissism, I think this is Conrad, isn't it?
Yeah.
They invented this character narcissism, so it was a kind of narcissism and humility sort of dialogue, but they use some kind of cod-liddling for the character narcissism, to make them sound really self-important and grandiose. Thou hast the audacity to come to mine regal palace and feed humility with scraps, rather than with the pleasure of foods from my bountiful table. I mean, it's not necessarily accurate, but they really responded to the medievalness of every man, you know, the funny sounds and the funny words and the slightly different syntax. And I thought that was just, and maybe this person had turned that to good dramatic effect because they were trying to use that, you know, methinks, etc., etc. You know, they were trying to use all of that to create an idiolect for this kind of very pompous character, narcissism, who contrasted totally with the other characters. So they did some fantastic work.
Yeah,
And it was really good.
when we read it, we gave them all an individual little bit of feedback so they had something to go back with, because I think we felt that was important to recognise that. We picked a couple of winners, and you came back in there, was this just after Easter?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
early summer, for a sort of celebration event. So we knew that by the end of the day we were going to distribute kind of awards. But so that they helped, you know, this kind of made another day's activity. We decided to base the day around medieval monsters, so we introduced them to the idea of different medieval monsters, and then we set them the challenge of creating their own medieval monster, and you can see a couple of examples on here. And I think what was really interesting about that day, and actually we saw it across all of the body work, is even though, as Stuart said, we were working with the scholars, we were able to see in two different age groups, we were able to see how this work it could kind of have access points for different abilities at different ages. So some of the students, when they were working on medieval monsters, were able to go, actually, we're not going to be so interested in the physically monstrous aspects of this character, we're going to think about more kind of internally, morally monstrous aspects. Others went for the more literal, but it gave both of them those entry points in, and I think we saw that in both areas. So yeah, we kind of had a day where it all kind of culminated. There's a bunch of happy-looking students in front of our library. There they are, the session of tales, and the winners, some of the winners with us.
Yeah.
And we got very good student feedback.
Yeah, we've got some fabulous feedback actually. I mean, as we say, studying around blah blah was more entertaining than you could have expected. So that says something about their expectations, doesn't it? Each line was kind in depth. And I thought the second one was interesting. The experience truly opened my eyes to view the past in a different light. And afternoons of acting, deep analysis of medieval paintings and artefacts. I enjoyed 2 days of amazing enrichment that I would never be able to find in a standard classroom. So that is priceless. That is, as collaborations go, the ability to be able to work with experts in the field, whilst also having the manuscripts and the Barber Institutes. It was an amazing opportunity, and clearly the children have really kind of enjoyed that enormously. The third one, we were lucky enough to have the opportunity to brush our fingertips with history, and that's a lovely phrase, isn't it? When we handled original medieval manuscripts. I mean, that's marvellous, and that's interesting because they do, because it's a selective school and they study Latin in year 7 and year 8. Some of them may go on to do it at A-levels. They study Greek. The guys had great fun in terms of when they were looking at those medieval manuscripts, trying to pick out the old Latin word that they had a point to reference with. So that was marvellous. And then a creative writing opportunity. But I think what speaks from that slide is the eclectic nature of the experience, the handling of the manuscripts, the creative elements, the reading of the paintings. So that kind of dry, dusty notion of reading medieval texts and being boring, actually it came across as a really exciting experience.
And I think we learned quite a lot as well. I mean, I certainly think from kind of an HE perspective, really brought home to us the importance of those in-person on-campus sessions, getting students to us. We can take digital resources out, but it was that tactile, sensory aspect that I think we spoke to. And also, it certainly made me think of the countable tales exercises of ways we might introduce similar exercises at undergraduate level. So Liv and I, over the years, kind of keep adapting what we do. Like there's still an essay. There's a kind of now an increasingly guided commentary exercise. It's interesting what you were saying, Jackie, about how it's changed in Cambridge, because I think ours is kind of moving down as well. I'm reading some of those portraits from the students. I thought, actually, could we get our students to do something creative, but with then a kind of reflective piece where they're explaining the decisions that they made in light of what they've learned about Chaucer. I thought for some students that would be a different, perhaps better way for them to show their knowledge and understanding of it. So it certainly prompted those thoughts for me. And no, Stuart, you thought when you hear about ways in which you...
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for a start, I'm going to have conversations with my colleagues and try and encourage colleagues to kind of let's bring medieval literature onto the curriculum. I think also with Hannah, my history colleague at school, I think we're going to try and have some joined up thinking, so that if they are going to Goodrich Castle, if they are going to Church of Kempley, let's try and tie in so there's some kind of English history crossover. I think that would be marvellous. I think let's incorporate some Beowulf, some Gawain, Green Knight into the Key Stage 3. I think it's difficult at Key Stage 4 because Key Stage 4, your hands are tied to a certain extent, though what we've done can feed into the Inspector Calls. But yeah, we're going to try and incorporate a lot more actually, and not being scared about it. Recognise, and I think Jackie, you were talking about it earlier, and it was the experience that we had, that the medieval, to my mind at least, the medieval culture is very much a visual culture, and I think that's the way into it for our students. And also the collaboration is a marvellous opportunity for the students to actually go on a campus, be in a lecture theatre, go into the research library, and gave them a real appreciation of university and what that looks like. So no, it was marvellous, and then hopefully we'll continue in the future.
So we've got here, this is quite kind of very techy, but this QR code should take you to a Padlet where we've uploaded all of the resources that we used. So we'll be able to see in a bit more detail the session with monsters, fantasy tales. Some of it is all samples of what the students produce, items that we saw in the bar there. Yeah. Just as a kind of, because we couldn't show everything that we did in the course of this. Looks fun too. It worked. So it worked. So that's it. And I think we had some questions, didn't we? Being able to open it up to stimulate.
I think to complete the thing I would say is what I realised from this, and I think they talked about this as well, is that where do university students come from? They come from school. But where do teachers come from? They come from university students, right? So there's a kind of cyclical nature to this, that if you don't do it at university, you won't teach it, and if you don't teach it, your students won't learn it, and if they don't learn it, they probably won't do it at university, and so around it goes. Particularly at a university like ours, where, as Emily said at the start, we have this streamlining of the curriculum, we don't have a lot of space, we're competing constantly, for want of a better word, with other modules on other topics, on other subjects, other authors, and we need to find a way to stimulate that. If it starts with fall, then that's hopefully...
I think, and Chris touched on an interesting point earlier when he said that if we go back 10 years or 15 years, even if you didn't have a ground in Chaucer, you teach yourself and you'd be fine. We don't see evidence of that these days. Increasingly, people come to us, new teachers come to us, they've studied lots of Victorian literature, they've studied Shakespeare, they've studied modernism, contemporary literature, they've studied some kind of niche, modern kind of subject, but they haven't studied Chaucer, and they're less willing to kind of teach at A-level, let alone kind of play around with a Key Stage 3. So I think we've got a responsibility to try and,
sort of break that circle.
I think so.
And I think what's wonderful about Day Like Today is clearly all of us in here share the same desire to kind of want it to keep going, want to put resources together, but because of the particular challenges that you've mentioned, Jackie, that things don't, for us as academics, we put these resources together, but you kind of have to do it in your own time and accept that it's not going to count. But maybe the answer is that we can't do it as individuals, but together, putting sort of resources together, that people can share it, sort of makes the job a little bit.
Or that we can advocate as well. I mean, we had a meeting recently, didn't we, about where it was sort of becoming clear that for reasons of admissions and wanting to get applications to English up,
which are not going in the right direction. I didn't measure the something. The suddenly management will seem to be a kind of slight softening about, the making of this kind of thing, and a slight recalibration where suddenly it might look like you were trying to help the university's effort to garner more students and more applications. And if you were doing something that might help with that, then suddenly that might look slightly more valuable to the university at this particular moment in time, which is not to say it would always, but that we might be at a particular juncture where these sorts of activities suddenly might start to find slightly more, for want of a better word, a reward within the workplace, or kind of, might be seen as something other than the completely irrelevant to the work of academics.
So you may all have questions to ask, but we also put some questions together, which I think a lot of them have already been answered today, but you can see some for those of you in the room that are teachers about how much mental knowledge you did at school, how comfortable you feel teaching it, and then same for us actually. I didn't do any medical literature, you did.
And I actually think that I was supposed to do the web class fellow at Taylor A-level, so my second year of A-level did it. And I was taught by a fantastic teacher who, I think in retrospect, looking back, I realised that was probably the moment that turned me into that, even though I didn't realise it at the time. Because when I got to university, I picked Old English because I loved the web graph, but I wasn't afraid, I thought, well, this is just more of the stuff that I really enjoyed at A-level, so of course I'm going to do that, and it didn't feel intimidating because I'd done that work at A-level. And it was just a fantastic experience. And ultimately, I did a PhD and I wrote a book on Chaucer. I sometimes I do trace it all back to that moment in that classroom of being in that room with my peers, my mates, and this is thank you, this is art, which is fantastic. Different experiences, the kind of important things.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you to everyone for staying the distance. I know we've packed a lot in today. And we've also gone over time. So Laura had these kind of mentioned the sort of 7-minute poem. So we have 15 minutes to write a manifesto. So we're excited. But I have to do this. I'm sorry. The previous session was mentioned that actually universities might be now more interested than perhaps they have been in the past to make contacts with schools, and the kind of work of engaging with school level teaching by academics, which was being devalued, is now being more valued a little bit because universities like mine are desperate for undergraduates, and indeed especially fee-paying international MA students. But I know you guys can't help with that. But if there are, so when I mentioned that I was doing this day, it's a long way of saying that some outreach people got very excited and were very keen that I should present you with that QR code. If you are a school teacher and you would like contact with Queen Mary, University of London, please, if you could scan that code, it will lead you to a form. Even if you don't do that, I will anyway send you the form after this event. So just to reiterate, that we will email all participants the PowerPoints that have been presented today. This day is actually being recorded. We should first have said that at the beginning. I wasn't aware that it was going to be recorded. But somehow, I don't know how, that's aspects of that, parts of that recording may well become available. I'm not too sure how that's going to work. But anyway, so the session that has, this idea actually came from Catherine Clark, I think, in one of our sort of brainstorming sessions, which was how do we sort of wrap up today? And so part of this session, I think, is, in the time we have, just meant to be reflecting. It can be anything on, questions and thoughts that haven't been answered from what we've heard so far today. But then we're also interested in building from this and, coming up with a mission statement for teaching Chaucer and medieval literature in general, or at least some thoughts towards the mission statement, right? So these are the questions that we sort of began with, and in thinking of what we might sort of cover in this session, I have a few prompts, and I'll just sort of, but what I want to really do is just open this discussion out. I think my focus on in these questions, I think maybe we know why we do it, although I think it's important sometimes to articulate that. I wondered if we could perhaps start with the resources question. And that's come up a few times. I mean, Chris mentioned it in his opening talk. We've talked about it in our breakout groups. We've heard various of resources that we already have and use, but which we could maybe share. But do we need to create new resources, or perhaps just better share the ones we already have? What do we lack, I suppose, in teaching Chaucer at school and university level? So that would be one kind of question for us. Now, other kinds of questions maybe in terms of the second question, the third question rather on that list, how do we keep Chaucer on the A-level curriculum and introduce other medieval authors? I mean, it's been very interesting to hear about paths, I guess, earlier than A-level, that you can introduce medieval literature and actually link medieval texts to modern texts that are kind of embedded in the A-level syllabus. So, I mean, I'm amazed at how many times I've heard Inspector Calls mentioned today, session that day on Chaucer. But then it was pointed out in the session we had here, the breakout session here, that there's been, that by teaching medieval morality plays earlier in the, at Key Stage 3, I think, right, you then make a case for that becomes relevant for the students when they study an Inspector course, so they can link the medieval text to this kind of entrenched modern text. Anyway, so let me open the discussion, open the floor for comments. The first thing, maybe just ask this question about resources, really. I mean, what resources do we, as teachers, whether at school or university, feel are lacking? And are there things that, we could actually work to provide each other? So I'll just please feel free to, say anything, ask anything, or reflect on that. Yeah.
I think that to say that I would love if some of the academics could write the organized style big merchant stuff. So there is actually that kind of wider thing for your sort of weekend A-level students. There's the advanced topics, but there's not anything that actually the students will struggle for way in. There doesn't exist a kind of CV variant access to medieval. Medieval feels like it's immediate reading, and it's very style students. And my weaker end find it really hard because they don't have resources.
What do they need?
They need a kind of very sort of GCSE style. Here are the characters and these are the themes that these characters explore. These are the key tensions, these are contextual links you could make. Here's how you unpick a critical contention, and they need that kind of very sort of guided step through. Whereas at the moment everything's kind of happening in an academic discourse. There is a kind of school discourse version, unless you drop right the way down in your written stage 3 translations. There's a bit of a kind of a gap for your weaker A-level students. That would be my request.
Does that sort of guidance exist for any of the other Canterbury tales as far as you're aware?
No, it does. I've only ever taught the Merchant's Tale. I imagine there might be more out there for the Wife of Bath. It's been around specs for longer, but I'm not sure.
Yes, I've done the various people who have hands on that, but then okay, no, go ahead.
I said it before, Shakespeare teaching is still problematic in lots of schools, but it was transformed by Rex Gibson's Shakespeare into Schools project. And so, even in my A-level college, we took away the storm editions, we put them in book boxes and that's pennies, but the thing we got was the Shakespeare Schools edition, and then there were book boxes in every class, in 5 classes, lots of different editions. That's what I said a bit facetiously about spearing, killing Michael Barr. It's prologue, teaching it to A-level students. Lots of them not been able to access that one. So I think choosing, when you do this thing, talking to the examiners, we'll share, not sort of saying here as usual about what's going on in the performance in the A-level and the GCSE, and I think we'll knowledge to be entertaining. And I think taking the spirit of Rex Gibson, you just summon Chaucer, like general prologue, Chaucer and this life of art that we've been with.
But so go through the exam, so for academics who wanted to sort of be part of this, we would maybe first go to exam boards and get...
I can pass it when Becky wants to pass it, like that.
Okay. Good. What else do people think in terms of resources that we need? Yeah.
Because there's been a lot of talk today about how visual appearance it is. I would love kind of a central website, something that I could go to draw resources for my own teaching and lesson planning. Because at the moment you are like on random Chaucer websites like the 1990 or whatever it is, and you're pulling from loads of different like online manuscripts and stuff like that. And it is quite time intensive. And I would love if there was something a little more accessible for me as a teacher to try and introduce that to my students, because it's often a really good way into a Chaucer unit, whether it's history or A-level, to kind of get them immersed in that period. But it's hard sometimes to be a step or all that bit of maths expert. I don't know if it's possible, but
I think it could be really quite easy for the version with the age. With what you mentioned, the very connection. There's some useful benefits to those, including what expects to be developed. That kind of stuff, which Chaucer is obviously exceptionally terrific on, and you can find they're all online today, so that I think that's something that could be done. That's certainly manuscript level. Some really nice images that students can I think if anything about other aspects of the period that we pinched around in the kind of religious aspects, perhaps, if I teach the part I'll show part that kind of, into a part, that kind of thing. So it's about thinking about other things, I suppose. It's just kind of how to into that. I think that being reached in the university, which was there as well as in some countries, we've been updating our lot of things it's like, we might have this, and then you're kind of like, that's a bit where just worry about only darkness students for so many years, so they've got too many tabs in, just got one place to actually put, it's easily there, which is
I guess your problem is some of those things go out of date as well, and links, and I mean, like the Chaucer blog, I don't know if you used to use this. Chaucer has a blog, and then I don't think Chaucer has a blog for some years now, unfortunately. Other thoughts about resources, what we need, either university level or...
What I find difficult at university level, I was really glad to see that the Oxford thing is coming, the paperback and the Cambridge thing is coming, because stuff's not accountable terms. I teach a lot of the dream visions, and Larry Benson's wonderful Chaucer page, brilliant, fantastic for interlinear translations from accountable terms, and then you get really stuck with the Legend of Good Women, which actually students love. They really get on with the Legend of Good Women. But I sit there annotating PDFs, and then of course you're getting difficulties because they're not very accessible. Accessible, more accessible copies of a wider range of text. Maybe that will come to these paperback and editions of Oxford and Cambridge books.
This makes the negative off this film really. The approach to the art, we've got a remarkable level of autonomy. wonder why they want to see so much on it. It's funded by the government. It's 1,000 poems up there in chronological timelines, chosen by poets and educators. With 16 plus, 14 plus, we've chucked a whole of the GCSE curriculum poems into 14 plus. 13 plus, and there's 11 plus and the 7 plus who joining the primary one in February. Point is, these are all really carefully mediated and looked at, and we have poets and educators writing brief poem and contextualizations and poet contextualizations. The real audience, it's worth remembering that they wouldn't worry about A-level, and there are about 700,000 students a year, and about 60,000 doing 60,000 18 subjects. So my vision was just to make it available to this community is to have some short excerpts with playful and interrogative, playful responses by contemporary poets, and short excerpts of someone speaking the poem and bits from Patience and maybe speaking Patience Akbari. We already put student recitations on, and this year's key 18-year-old winner recited from The Life of Bar.
That's amazing.
Yeah, from Durham, taught himself to do it. Previously, the first winner, who'd been going 14 years, was from Galway. The students like doing all stuff, and the younger people were saying, and often people do something in Key Stage 3, there's not much material still except the photograph. So what I'm saying is we've got really good design, the website gets 5 million visits, we've got the Globe annual thing, and both Julie Blake and I would like to work with the English Association in developing some coverage that goes back before 1500. I mean, how would we like? We have a designer who all looks good, and students engage with it, teachers engage with it too. And when we end up having to do a competition, competition is expected. The real thing is to make some free to use, responsibly designed, interesting designed resources. So I came against today, most people say, it's yours. You can have that. If it's anything responsibly, some funding, I bet you might talk about that. I don't think that's very expensive funding. All the architecture is there. So,
And all the resources are free.
Yeah.
That's really important.
So we use the reading version, and visually the website is very interesting.
and then we've got some posters out as well. We give out posters for schools, then choose next year's posters to be Dream of the Room, Chaucer, Langland, or whatever. And we're already working on a shop after this. We're looking at German products we've got in my game. I used to work for Trevor the Chaucer man, and he gave me Vincent's IPA for a few things, including Manila's Tail and Linen Prologue and that. So we're going to put those up in. So we've already worked. I'm just saying it's there, thanks.
Okay. Yeah. I haven't heard anyone mention, maybe it has come up, the Middle English Dictionary, which is, the OED is by subscription, and that's wonderful because the Middle English Dictionary is free. And I don't know if it's quite recent, but I've noticed recently that you can actually reverse look if you want to find a word for the Middle English equivalent for a word. And also, often, so you could also very quickly have a spreadsheet that you can generate with every single time, say, Chaucer's Miller's Tale is cited. All sorts of great school activities could happen with that. You can, a lot of times there are links to online, responsible online texts of the other works cited, including the Chaucer for that matter. And I haven't heard that mentioned, but it is only the last 10 years or so has it been available for free. And it's just an amazing resource.
And even interface that you could use. Because
Yeah.
previously you typed it it was exactly
Some things. But now it's a very user-friendly interface. It's great for a single classroom. You can do a project one day. I try to do 1 week where they really get into the dictionary and lots of questions are asked from it. So I just wanted, as a resource available.
We just want to
this is brutal out today, I just want to put it out there. Term 5 for me, particularly stage 3, will be medieval matters. Medieval matters, but the month that we're in, matters. Medieval matters. So the Empathy Day lab work will be a showcase on the 26th, where on that day, year 7, 8 and 9, period 1, year 7, year 2, year 8, period 3, year 9, will all present, discuss, legislate on Chaucer. That's what I can offer to say that's in the pipeline. There's a great bit of history to riff off as well. So, shall we pipe you up to say that down? Or should we make that flow going?
But I'm still teaching when they're doing
All the way to that. Yeah, just on the A-level question, I mean, is that something, maybe it's a question for the school teachers in the room, I mean, is there something university academics can do to help keep Chaucer on the A-level curriculum? We've heard quite a bit about, the difficulties maybe of keeping Chaucer, or the problems with keeping that Chaucer on the curriculum. Or should we be more actually working on some of the comments I've heard suggest that actually it might be more helpful for academics to be inputting at earlier stages, like what you were just outlining, and then letting that kind of connect with the A-level. Is there lobbying work, that we should be doing, and who should we be lobbying?
AQA, this is the first time on the English language exam paper, Inspirations in Creative Reading and Writing. Section A, Section B, Section B, question 5. It's the first time they've ever said, use your imagination. Ever. Because of the restriction. Yes, people have trotted out all the York notes for power and conflict poetry or love and relationship poetry. What was assessed for the first time in 2025 was worlds and lives. And that speaks to this world. And what I've learned so far, it speaks to that world as well. And there's a use your imagination. There is more, because I just hammer them in pre-Raphaelite images, but now, having seen this, having seen and learned today, that imagery can go in deep. From all the playfulness upstairs that we do, from the storyboards, etc. That there is a link there with visual imagery and creative writing. There's a link there, because when I'm going to boost my kids' grades, that's what you're going into. When we have set up Digital 30 Plus for the creative learning panel for 2 years, that's probably what we need here. The Shakespeare Schools Festival, Shakespeare, so that's what we need here. There's something like that of that calibre. Yes, it'll be small, but that's why I'm putting in the summer. So put all the Shakespeare to do now. It's fun. And once you've done that, we've got it. Send them to the start list, and then the rest will follow. Because it will. We can teach local to year 8s. We've looked at symbolic representation, movement and start. We've already got it in here. So there is a facility that there'll be a movement, and if my students, rich, diverse group of kids, if they can rattle up representation and language in different languages from different religions, they can handle this.
I agree with you. Thank you also. There's no difference of opinion between the people in this room and AQA. We work with them quite closely. In fact, we work on the advice and mediating that on our website. And then we know that we put imagination back into those questions. Where they are frustrated by the kind of knowledge, self-limiting knowledge dumping, I guess in exams, from descriptive teaching, particularly coming out of directive, sometimes coming out of directed academies, sometimes coming out of things like academies, sometimes coming out of things like art mastery.
Yes.
Misunderstood bits of holiday and semantic fields in that all over the place. That's very nonsense.
That's very nonsense.
There's no connection to break this. Anyway, the point is that Park Academy have got a bastardised version of it. They've got apparently manual version of it. and that's now been doing. And an example that I think the thing is that for the mass audience, that means going back to just in routine for child and primary school to find a little bit of Chaucer, a little bit of Anglo-Saxon, really work like that. It's used to happen actually, well, with it in the past. And then I think we've already got a great advocate and Becky in this work in this association, she knows it, and they want to do something.
In terms of A-level, just speaking from our experience to some point, we follow the Educlass exam board, which is the English on the Welsh board. Chaucer appears, as I said earlier, on the pre-1770 paper. And most of my colleagues are resistant to teach Chaucer when they can teach Rossetti instead, because they think it's easier. And when one mark comes down to whether a student goes to their first choice university or not, most colleagues are more inclined to teach the Rossetti or be done. I think teachers would be more inclined to engage with Chaucer if it was not on an exam paper, or if it was on coursework. So, for example, coursework accounts for 20% for English literature. And I think there's always the risk that if you choose Chaucer, there's then the possibility that if the kids don't get the grades that they need, they don't get into their Russell Greek University, you're going to have some very upset parents, very upset children on August 14th. So therefore they choose the easier option, Rossetti, which perhaps isn't challenging, but they can get the grade. Whereas I think if maybe on some boards, I don't know, but if it was, for example, coursework for us, we would definitely choose it reasonably because we've got a little bit more control of it. And it's also, in the Chaucer, you also have the feint of examiners. And I know I examined for Educlass for that poetry paper, that there are varying levels of experience and judgment. So it's just a bit of a risk. I think when they're studying Chaucer in year 6, the stakes are high. And therefore many schools, many students try and navigate a safer path. Whereas if it was coursework, I think it would be more limited encouragement perhaps.
And I think for that reason, there aren't really how to teach Chaucer guides out there. Like teaching Shakespeare, probably thousands of books. You know, I know I've got one on my bookshelf. I don't think I've ever actually picked up and read. But Chaucer will sit on that kind of facility, so that at least people are confident and without actually the capacity to upskill, without doing a lot of work that teachers simply don't have time for. So easily accessible teaching Chaucer guides, I think, is something that will make it more.
Let's touch on that very quickly. It's come up a few times today that the teachers might just be not confident and might not therefore be willing to take on other medieval authors. Is there something we could do, actually, would it help to have a day, or like this kind of day, but specifically aimed at teachers who are interested in upskilling, if you like, and maybe bring with that, I guess, kind of have to be more than a day, but something kind of like a course that you could do that's connected to it, or with that, would there be a sort of mark? Do you think would that just fall flat?
I think because teachers do want to make the best choices for their students, and actually the best choice might be the medieval option. We used to do Rossetti compared with Malfi, and Rossetti and Malfi did not come together. We had to work really hard in order to make that a comparative test, where actually Malfi sits well better with Merchant and Dexter. And so actually, for some people it is the best choice. And if there is a text in the paper and people are trying to work out what they're going to do, then actually to have a day where you can go and find out about that, I think is something that students would be curious about. But I think as well, having hard copies where, it's a book, it's got some activities in it you can try, it's got, guides to the language, it's got if people reading it, here's some wide reading you can explore. That kind of just breaking it down helps begin teaching it, just people confidence.
Jack's on the head up first, and then guys.
So this was broken up, but I was also thinking about a masterclass, in sort of masterclass day or event being announced to this. I just wanted to ask the teachers, if something like that could run, obviously I imagine we would all prefer to be in person in order to capture a range of our teachers. Would there be interest on either side in something online course that might run? Definitely a short thing that might run a few sessions at a particular time that I think range one.
I think that kind of like 4 till 6 window where teachers are normally, doing their marking or whatever after school, like that kind of thing, generally getting cover. If it was running during the week, like teachers can't get covering. We can't have trips because we can't pay. This is a good idea. So, and if you're travelling down, I paid to this because to get on the train because I live Chaucer and wanted to go. But if you have teachers to actually can't do that or don't have the capacity, then I think online things are really helpful and a bit more kind of easily attended and would get a wider reach. But maybe it could be, recording to online events as well. So
Yeah, so I think when we first touched on it, the first thing we thought we'd like to do was exercise the doubt. But the best stumbling block that we came across was getting in touch with the teachers. Very, very obvious. The reason they don't have time to answer that's right. Exactly. The most of probably don't have time to read anyone else. So we real trouble we didn't know how to reach the constituency that we wanted to reach today. Would you like to either do something online, or would you like the teachers and residents to constantly send it? And we'll do that today. Well, one of our former colleagues, the events used to run on school Chaucer versions on campus, and they would be a whole day traffic. We both thought we'd love to do that. Yeah, we still would, but we just couldn't figure out how to reach the teachers. Like, well, if any teachers have any ideas about how to do that, do you know what I mean? Like how you might walk them in the EA, that I don't know, but I don't know how you bridge that space between us and all these teachers in all these schools, in all these different contexts and towns.
We at Solid Hall, 2 years ago, we ran a Shakespeare festival, and we wrote to as many state schools and independent schools within 2-hour radius of Solid Hall. So Solid Hall's on the M42, so we have people coming from Repton up north, we have people from Westminster coming. We had just under 500 people on this one day. There was a raft of lectures from very eminent Shakespeareans, such as Jonathan Bates, Michael Dobson, Tiffany Stern, Roger Lewis came over from Princeton. And we had some really fabulous speakers. So it was essentially a HAY festival style of day for Shakespeare. And we had lots of kind of A-level students from across the country come. Potentially, there's scope to do a similar thing for Chaucer. So you could write to all the different schools who teach Chaucer, and then fabulous academics come for the day, and then give various lectures on aspects of content or different tales. We had kind of lectures that took place in the main hall that everybody listened to, but then there were also carousel events whereby people could opt into different talks. And that worked really well. And so theoretically, a similar thing could happen for Chaucer. So you could have A-level students and teachers come to a single festival on a day. It worked really well for Shakespeare. We're doing it again in March, and so there's kind of a blueprint for it, but we'll work very much.
I mean, just on that note, I mean, I've probably said this to a few people, but I mean, the idea is that this today is not just a sort of one-off, but that we do keep something like this. It may not be exactly what we've done today, but something we do this regularly enough that sort of like whether it's an annual event or biannual event, that we do keep trying to have events that bring together, school teachers, university teachers, and everyone else who's interested. So, this is meant to be just the start. But it's like obviously you could take different forms and different levels of ambition, and whether you're doing it online or in person, like all those are questions to sort of cover.
And it'd be great if we could replicate the Shakespeare Festival that we had and say get 400 form students who are studying Chaucer in the same room. And sort of draw from eminent academics out of that.
Yeah.
So national kind of excellent research.
Well, I hope we have 400 people today. I think I've worked out that way. But, I mean, but yeah, we'll always, Chaucer will always be a little bit smaller. Yeah, but still has.
Just so the English and Medium Centre, if you can align them, get on their magazine or get on their next academic year, because when Worlds and Lives got implemented, it was almost 2 years in the making.
Right. Yeah.
So if you can, if there's an alignment process, you can get there.
I did try and get involved in this and they do it, but yeah, but that's
I would echo that because I only found out about this day by chance because my school librarian happened to be signed up something that had mentioned it, and then she go, oh, I'll forward that on to Mr. Wilson, who's the head of English, and then people would say on to me. So like it went through many people, and it was very like chancy that I even knew that this was even going on.
Yeah.
So I think EMC is probably the easiest way to reach a very wide number of English teachers and reach out to that community. So probably it's just not like that.
Yeah.
Teachers don't tend to subscribe, or that's the thing, I don't tend to subscribe to many magazines or articles or things because I don't have the time to read them. So I did initially, but I dropped all that kind of stuff and just
I would also bring up it's the most widely read interactive with one for English teachers. Other than that, there's me, the international social teachers very much.
I would on that note also say ENC doesn't have a huge amount of Merchant's Tale. So if anyone does want to write anything on Merchant's Tale for ENC, would be welcome.
I'd like to speak up for students. In my experience, students are interested in their wild choices. And sometimes teachers don't do that. So I think just making available text so that students can find it, at least at the schools that we go, I think that's good, isn't it? It's there for the students. Sometimes want to find something out without the teacher.
I think one of the things that we've done a few times today, that during my experience, the problem actually isn't students. It's not even students being uninterested in Chaucer or any other medieval when they're exposed to it, but it's just getting them over the initial, sense that they're not going to like this, or that they've just never encountered it. Once you do that, it's not difficult actually to people interested and engaged. But yes, to highlight the real problems, the challenges of teaching in Middle English, which is harder and harder for students to understand this straight away. So yeah, there's still difficulties, but huge interest and enthusiasm that we do get from students. I think at university and for what I've learned today also at school. I think we may be really out of time, we're way beyond when we said we were going to have, but it's been a really helpful discussion. I need to thank a few people, I thank the English Association and the Institute of English Studies who really helped made this possible to have this here and also to publicise it and organise it. I just also like to thank, as well as already thank the UCL, Queen Mary and Holloway who put in some money for the food and everything. Senate House Library, Karen Upland did the wonderful exhibition Words of Australia, so I think it was really great. Thank you to Alistair and Natalie and Catherine who were really helpful in helping to sort of formulate ideas for today. But also really major thanks to everyone who came today and participated and discussed ideas. I think, we haven't got a manifesto for Chaucer exactly, but we will kind of keep working on it. We've certainly got a lot of potential material and also some ideas for things we need to provide and need to produce and the conversations we need to keep having. So we will keep having that. So yeah, we will be in touch.
Thank you, Alfred.
Yeah.